From the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C.
We have over 80 illustrious in-person attendees who represent libraries, archives, museums, and other entities in government, universities, and elsewhere, ranging from the U.S. Department of Justice, the Department of State, Homeland Security, and the Fish and Wildlife Service, not to mention the Senate, House of Representatives, Marine Corps, Navy, and NASA, to the National Library of Medicine, National Geographic, National Gallery of Art, the Holocaust Museum, Catholic University, George Mason University, and many, many others coming in person to this event, which we're very delighted about. But we also want to welcome the 50 remote attendees who are coming to us via the web from the LBJ Library, the Yukon Archives, the Canadian Conservation Institute, New York Public Library, the Museum of Fine Arts in Houston, the UN International Criminal Tribunal, Government Printing Office, and such universities as Cornell, the University of Michigan, Dominican University, UCLA, Johns Hopkins, East Carolina University, Iowa State, the University of Hawaii, Princeton, Yale, Norwich University in Great Britain, Rice, University of Kansas, Case Western University, and the University of Pretoria, South Africa, which has got to be the most distant university. So welcome to all of you. We're very pleased that you're attending. If you have any trouble connecting to us during this event, we would remind you that there will be streaming video occurring later on our website. So don't get discouraged. The event will be fully reproducible later on our website. If you have trouble hearing us, come back to us later through our streaming video. It will be an excellent reproduction later. This is the third and final symposium in the 2010 to 2011 Future Directions series in preservation at the library, which was organized by the library's Preservation Directorate. This symposium is co-sponsored by the Council on Library and Information Resources, with additional support provided by the Foundation of the American Institute for Conservation, and they have provided the outstanding catering for this event. The third-part series began in October 2010 with Understanding the Physical Environment, which was followed in March 2011 with Assessing Options for Large Collections. And you will find those symposiums on our website as streaming video. This series covered the journey which we as stewards of the human cultural record have made and the future challenges we face as we attempt to balance the preservation needs of our legacy collections with the growing and complex demands presented by the collection of converted and born digital assets, particularly during these tight fiscal times. We know that some of these collections and records are highly vulnerable, particularly our most recent cultural heritage found in plastic and time-based media, which can only be preserved digitally. We also know that preserving born digital collections is just an immense challenge. Since the 1990s, this challenge has posed an ever greater portion of our holdings, rapidly approaching 100% of what is being produced and delivered to many of our repositories. So this is just a challenge that we're facing every day and we're finding ever more difficult. The speakers we've invited to address these issues include the leaders of some of these of the nation's largest cultural and scientific repositories. We've asked these speakers to talk about their greatest preservation challenges, their greatest risks, and their greatest successes in these areas. We've asked them where they're headed in achieving a balance in analog and digital preservation, with a focus on what they might be able to do together as basically federal alpha wolves in the preservation field. Are there opportunities for collaboration to help us all better survive some of the external risks, such as the loss of external preservation training programs, with such things as the loss of the University of Texas at Austin program, and the cutbacks in funding that all federal programs are now facing? Are there solutions we can develop together to our most challenging shared problems? Some of the things that leap to mind are things such as modularized federal offsite storage repositories, which have been discussed in the past. We've asked the panelists for such ideas on what new opportunities might exist for our organizations, what risks might be approached differently, and what new models might exist for our considerations. We've also asked the panelists to suggest what new ideas and models and what new ideas that have been discussed might also be made scalable for smaller repositories, such as our state, federal, local, corporate, public, and private repositories that work with us. We've asked all of our participants, speakers and panelists alike, to consider such issues as how to save time-based media and indigenous language recordings, how to identify and safely duplicate the most at-risk audiovisual recordings and cellulose acetate film negatives, how to select and preserve websites and transient media before they vanish, how best to develop funding mechanisms for digital preservation that can be used effectively by smaller organizations, how to retrain traditional repository staff and basic digital preservation skills, how to ensure that sufficient preservation teaching and training programs exist for the future, and such issues as how to involve the public, the federal, state, and local employees at all levels, such as today's audience in preservation of our nation's heritage, so that it's supported into the future, and how best to reprioritize and refocus our resources in this time of crucial resource shortages, so that analog preservation does not have to erode, so that digital preservation can flourish. So with no further ado, I'd like to introduce Diane van der Weyden, who has been at LC for almost 10 years now, most recently as Director of Preservation, and who started the library's Future Directions in Preservation Symposia. She'll introduce our first speaker, Dr. Deanna Marcum.
Thank you, Diane, very much for that introduction and also for organizing today's program. Diane Vogt-O'Connor has worked at all of the major institutions that will be speaking this morning, and that's because of her background in library science, museums, and archives, and we're very happy that she's brought those talents to the library. I also want to thank her and Mary Oey, who is our preservation education specialist, for coordinating this symposium. And also I want to acknowledge their work on the final edition of the Library Services Journal. You may have seen this in the back, and please pick one up. This final version, edition, focuses on preservation at the Library of Congress. And the Library Services Journal was started by Dr. Deanna Marcum, who is the Associate Librarian of Congress, and who, I'm sorry, we need to change the slide. Oh, sorry, okay, yeah. She's the Associate Librarian of Congress, and I have the honor of introducing her today. I want to start by saying that regrettably to us, Dr. Marcum has announced her retirement effective this December. Because of this, I'd like to take a few extra moments this morning to emphasize and underscore aspects of her career that have been extremely beneficial to the preservation field. In addition to her MLS that Dr. Marcum has, she also has a BA in English and a PhD in American Studies, and I think that this explains why she's such a riveting raconteur, or racontrice, and a very prolific author of 5 books, over 40 articles, and hundreds of lectures, many of which have very, very compelling arguments in support of preservation, and almost all of which have very clever titles, such as The Digital Deluge, and things that we can all relate to. Dr. Marcum was formerly the Dean of the School of Library and Information Science at Catholic University of America, which was also a boom to preservation because she's always supported preservation training, not only at Catholic University, but also more recently at the University of Maryland, and for the federal libraries, and for a number of other initiatives, such as just this month, we actually did an initiative training a Russian delegation for the library's Open World program. She also served as the president of the Council of Library Resources and president of the Commission on Preservation and Access, and oversaw the merger of those two entities into the Council on Library and Information Resources, CLIR. And she was the president of that until 2003. And during that time, she supported many seminal works on preservation, such as the Image Permanence Institute on new preservation tools. In 2003, Dr. Marcum was appointed the Librarian of Congress, by the Librarian of Congress to her current position, which manages library services programs and public programs, both on-site and overseas, because we have a number of overseas offices. But she also oversees the preservation activities for more than 147 million rare books, manuscripts, photographs, films, tapes, discs, and a whole wide range of materials that reflect the library's international and universal collection. When she started, Dr. Marcum oversaw 9 directorates, but within the first year, she streamlined that to 5. She also led a delegation of preservation experts and digitization experts to the National Library of Egypt to foster international outreach and partnerships, and she has continued to do that to China, Japan, and a number of other countries. The library has been a leader in preservation for over 2 centuries since its inception, but under Dr. Marcum's stewardship, a long list of advances have occurred. And I won't be able to go through the whole list because of our time limitations, but I just wanted to mention that she oversaw the opening of the state-of-the-arts facilities for audiovisual conservation at the Packard campus in Culpeper. She's seen that we've met our targets for filling the cold storage remote facility at Fort Meade. She's overseen improved environmental controls and shared platforms so that stakeholders can understand what's happening in their collections. She's revamped our 25-year-old science facilities because she recognizes that science is the foundation for sound preservation principles. And this is very cost beneficial to support our ability to do quality assurance, research and development, and analytical services for the collections of the 21st century. She's enabled us to hire 6 scientists, and we've instigated a visiting scientist program, which we've had 20 scientists from around the world already, and we've even started a science internship program. She also, however, has understood the importance and the cost benefit of a strong preventive conservation program, and she has helped us through expanding the preservation technician staff, facilities, and capabilities that we have. And we've, again, had over 30 interns just in the last few years in that program. The library's participated in 2 new Mellon-funded training initiatives, one for training library and archives conservation fellows with the University of Delaware, and another for training digital humanities fellows with CLEAR. The library has also expanded its preservation outreach programs, such as the one you see today, and we've had 60 events for our Topics in Preservation series. And we've also done more outreach, traveling to Iraq and to Ghana, and most recently to Japan, to help with the salvage of collections after the earthquake and tsunami there. Dr. Marcum has many other accomplishments that you can read about in the bio blurb that's in your handouts, but I'll just mention 2 more. One, she received a $2 million grant from the Alfred P. Sloan Foundation to digitize general collection books, which are now freely accessible. And perhaps the most important accomplishment is that she's the recipient of the prestigious Melville Dewey Medal from the American Library Association. As Winston Tabb has noted, this award recognizes that, among other things, Dr. Marcum has a unique ability to unite librarians, scholars, and publishers to focus on the most pressing challenges in the digital age. And she also has the ability to envision libraries as part of an international, interconnected, interdependent web of cultural heritage organizations. And it's precisely those organizations that we've gathered here today as speakers and panelists and among yourselves in the audience in order to be able to articulate why we need to continue to invest in the persistence of original source documents in the age of digitization. We all bear a fiduciary responsibility to employ best practices to preserve legacy collections, because they're not only cultural heritage assets, but they're also business assets, and they appreciate over time. We understand the full value of the evidence that's retained in these collections. Material science every day expands its capabilities to access information buried and hidden within our original primary source materials. We've had collaborations recently with the National Archives looking at the H.R. Haldeman papers in order to try and assess writing that's not visible through normal means. We've had collaborations with the Smithsonian looking at the Alexander Graham Bell recordings, being able to capture sound off of photographic emulsion on glass plates. We've had collaborations also with the National Park Service looking at their Edison cylinders and phonographs, which are just scored soot on paper. And through collaborations with Lawrence Berkeley National Labs, we've actually been able to extract sound from soot. So these are some of the achievements and accomplishments that have happened during Dr. Marcum's tenure here. The library and all of our sister agencies must safeguard this evidence, and because the ability to provide authoritative, uncorrupted evidence is critically important as our reality becomes more virtual. And we hope today that through this meeting we can collaborate on a lot of other projects, many of which Diane has already touched upon. So I'm going to conclude now by thanking all of our partners in this endeavor, and I hope that we'll have a very fruitful discussion. As Dr. Billington recently said, Dr. Marcum has been a creative and visionary leader responsible for integrating emerging digital resources and traditional artifact collections in the 21st century, and this is a challenge that will face all of us in this room in the future. So I'd like to ask Dr. Marcum to come to the podium. And I want to make a special presentation. We happen to have a very beautiful box that was put together by the very talented preservation staff, which contains a full set of the library LS journals. So thank you so much for your service to the library and to preservation. With that, I give you Dr. Marcum.
This is quite a surprise. Well, let me begin by saying I have not died. And I don't plan to die anytime soon. And one of the, there's a great temptation to just go off somewhere far, far away and send I guess you would send an email message now, not a telegram, saying, I have retired. But I do appreciate all of Diane's kind words very much. And I've been telling people when they ask, well, what are you going to do? My answer is that I'm going to work on issues that I care deeply about and find that I don't really have time to work on them when I am trying to do all of the administrative things that I've been doing for so many years. And preservation is at the top of that list. I really worry about preservation in this digital environment, and I've decided that because I've now announced my retirement, I can speak quite frankly about what I think some of the big concerns are and what I think we should be doing about them. So Diane gave us a list of about 3 years worth of things to talk about. I'm not going to talk about most of those. I'm going to talk about a little bit about where we've been and where I think we need to go. So let me begin by looking very, very briefly at the history of national programs. We have tried many times to address preservation at a national level. I became deeply involved in preservation when I was first at the Council on Library Resources in the 1980s. Jim Haas was the president of the council at that time. He had been the librarian at Columbia University. He had been the president of ARL, and he made preservation, he's the first one, I think, in my lifetime. And there were people before who did things too, but Jim Haas recognized that if a handful of the major research libraries did not take responsibility for preservation, it simply wouldn't happen. And he set up the first preservation unit in a major research library while he was at Columbia. He came to the Library of Congress and encouraged the library to take a national responsibility for preservation. And the Library of Congress responded by establishing what was then called the National Preservation Program. And its only purpose was to look outside the institution and make sure that what the library was learning about preservation was made available to the broader community. the money that the Council on Library Resources gave to the Library of Congress for this National Preservation Program did two things. It established a library on preservation, and in those days, because we didn't have email and we didn't have the web, these materials were actually photocopied and sent out to libraries across the country to make sure that what was being learned about preservation techniques was widely accessible to others who were struggling with the same issues. The Council on Library Resources also funded research at the Barrows Laboratory. How many of you are old enough to remember the Barrows Laboratory? A few of you. It was the research that looked hard at what was causing the deterioration of paper. What were the actual causes? And what could we do about those problems? That was an effort to, both the Barrows Lab work and the funding for the Library of Congress was really meant to help librarians think much more broadly about preservation issues and not focus solely on our own collections. There was also money given to the Library of Congress to provide training for preservation. This was in the early 1980s, and there were several programs that went around the country training people, and in large part, the work of the Council on Library Resources and the work of this National Preservation Program at the Library of Congress really raised awareness in research libraries, particularly everywhere, that preservation was an important need, and there needed to be money set aside for preservation, that it's not just something you add on or do in your spare time, but there is a focused program on preservation. The Council on Library Resources also funded the beginning of the University of Texas at Austin program. And there were other funders as well, but we were among the first and recognized, Jim Haas was a very interesting man. I miss him very much in the field. He's still alive, but not active. He said, the bench conservators will get training. They're passionate, they're driven, they will get the training they need. The people who aren't getting training are the people who manage preservation programs. And we need people who have the broadest kind of perspective to look at the entire institutional menu of need and focus then on meeting all of those managerial challenges, but keeping preservation in mind. And so the money that the council invested in the University of Texas program was aimed solely at preservation administration. There is now no program. There continue to be programs for conservation specialists, the bench conservators, but it's a great lack that we don't have programs aimed at preservation administration. And it is clearly not enough to have conservators become managers. That is not enough. And so I hope we can think about ways we address that issue as a community. The other thing that the Council on Library Resources did is establish the Commission on Preservation and Access. And we'd had a preservation program always in 1956, when the Council on Library Resources was formed, there had always been a preservation program. But we believed that the need was so great that we actually focus on preservation as a discrete activity. We established the Commission on Preservation and Access, and Patricia Batten came also from Columbia to head this program. And I was at the council when Pat came to take on this responsibility for the Commission on Preservation and Access. And so I saw firsthand how she went about establishing a national program. And I thought I would talk about that just a little bit because I think some of the lessons from it are still valid today. She worked with the National Endowment for the Humanities to establish a national microfilming program. And this was in 1987, and digital technology was just beginning. We were beginning to understand the power of digital technology. And many people were critical of Pat because she kept focusing on microfilming. And her critics said, well, why don't you just digitize everything? And she had two reasons for not doing that. One, it was still too expensive. And two, we didn't know enough about the preservation of digital objects to rely on that for a national program. So she worked very closely with the Congress, with the National Endowment for the Humanities, set up a program whereby institutions could identify important research collections that should be preserved on behalf of the nation. NEH made grants to selected institutions, and in the aggregate, there was, at least for a while, there was an effort to think about national collections that needed to be preserved and a program for getting the work done. Two problems with national programs of this kind, particularly if they depend upon congressional funding. It was set up as a 20-year program, and the first lesson you learn when you're in a federal agency is that no Congress can commit a subsequent Congress. So it's a 20-year program, but the funding is year by year. And so the program really wasn't funded for 20 years. And as fads change and other things become more important or seem to be more important, the old programs fade to the background. And it's understandable that we would make changes in technology. That goes without saying. But we don't have any longer, and I think it's a great tragedy. We no longer have a national plan for preserving research collections. That has faded away. And one of my hopes is to think about ways to restructure that program so that all of the individual preservation activities in our institutions add up to something on behalf of the nation. The Library of Congress was central to the National Preservation Plan in the early years. There was a microfilming unit at the Library of Congress, and Pat Batten worked very closely with Library of Congress staff to identify the research collections that would be microfilmed on behalf of the nation, quite apart from the preservation work that was being done for local collections. But that too faded when the Library of Congress made a decision to focus on deacidification as a scientific advancement, which was very important. The national effort at the Library of Congress really became the deacidification plan, mass deacidification plan. That too was a multiple decade program. It was congressionally funded. And now, of course, the congressional funding is not there. I mean, it's just part of the overall budget, and we have to think anew about, once these commitments are made and we have long terms of obligation, how do we revise the plans so they are still relevant today? And how do we look at the technology? And one of my hopes in the earlier Preservation Directions Forum is that mass deacidification would be looked at critically as a technology and answer the question, is it still what we hoped it would be? Is that still the direction we should take? Have other technologies overtaken this, and should we make adjustments? But we tend, when we don't have specific funding for a specific activity, we tend to just put it in the glob of other things, and we don't address these questions critically. So one of my challenges to you as a preservation community is to take a hard look at these technologies and make some critical assessments. Okay, so that's sort of, those are my hopes. That's what I'd like to charge all of you with helping me do. Now I have some other things I want to talk about, and time's getting away from me, so let me talk about a few other things. Preservation at the Library of Congress. Diane said the Library of Congress has been a leader in preservation for its entire history, and that is certainly true. The Library of Congress, for its first, I would say, it's 211 years old, and probably for the first 200 years, considered itself in different, this is a gross generalization, considered itself the library of last resort. And if you consider yourself the library of last resort, you have a very different approach to preservation than you have when you say, we're the library of first stop. And digital technology has allowed the Library of Congress to at least flirt with this notion that it's library of first stop. And the clash of cultures that comes from library of last resort, library of first stop, where do you make investments, I think is the critical question we're all grappling with. So do we try to put money into digitizing as many of our collections as we can so that they're available on the web to people who are looking there, or do we make the investments in our legacy collections, thinking that we will be the only collection that will preserve these materials? So I'm going to try to sort out that question a little bit. At least I'm probably not going to sort it out at all. I'm going to tell you what I've been thinking about. That's the truth of the matter. Digital technology has done more to raise questions about microfilming than anything else. We have, I don't know how many pieces of microfilm in this collection. It's staggering. We've been moving the master negatives to Fort Meade, our off-site environmentally good storage facility, and it is staggering to see the amount of microfilm that's there. We also know that there are students in college today who have never seen a microfilm reader, have never used microfilm, and would probably be appalled if we asked them to. Say, what are you talking about? We have to ask, what are we going to do with all this microfilm? We say we have preserved it, but if people don't use it, what good is it? And I know that is a radical statement to make. But I look at this enormous investment we've made in microfilming, and if we care about access, and I think the only reason to preserve anything is to make it accessible, we have to undertake a massive reformatting of that microfilm so that we can make it accessible. Fortunately, the technology is getting pretty good for converting microfilm to digital, and it's the cost is reasonable. It's just that we don't have money, but it's still, I mean, there are some very encouraging signs there. And I think one of the things we have to do is begin to look at what it will take to convert those microfilm collections that we've so carefully preserved in all of our institutions and figure out ways to make that material accessible. The other thing we have to look at is how many of us have done the same work. Microfilming has gone on in lots of different places. A lot of the same materials have been microfilmed. We only need to make it digitally accessible once. So again, I think there's an enormous need for a national program to think through how we are going to work on this collaboratively and make sure that we are dividing the work so that we're not duplicating things, but we're also making lots of contributions that add up to something very important for the nation. There are a number of print repositories that are being developed now, and I'm very encouraged by that development. A number of academic institutions have joined forces. They realize that the print monographs and bound journals and their collections are not being used very much. The advent of services like JSTOR and the Google Book digitization effort have resulted in students and faculty being able to go online and find a lot of the historical materials they're looking for. Not everything, to be sure, but a lot. And we know enough about our users, our younger users in particular, to know that they believe that if it's important to read, it's online. If it's worth knowing, it's online. And because they can find so much online, they don't question what is missing. So I think we have an enormous challenge trying to figure out how do we get our materials to where they are, because they're definitely living in that world. And we have made the investment in preservation, so I think we should continue making investments to make these materials accessible as well. And these shared repositories for monographs, libraries are saying, okay, we'll have one copy of this item, and we'll share it. If anyone needs to see the artifactual copy, it will be there, and we'll use the digital version for providing access. And I think that's economically, managerially smart. But what I worry about, there is a component missing in all of the programs that I've seen for shared repositories. Preservation is talked about, but there are no real provisions for the preservation of these materials. And I think of these a little bit, these print repositories, a little bit as the Fort Knoxes of our intellectual heritage. We're putting these materials there in case someone needs to look at them, but we can't just put them in a cold place and say that that's enough. We have to make sure that preservation is taken really seriously for those shared collections. And as more and more libraries investigate these possibilities, I hope that preservation will be a more important part of the equation. At the Library of Congress, we have had a policy, I guess for our entire history, that for as long as we can, we will save the artifactual item. Because we think it's part of, it's our contribution to the scholarly community to, as much as possible, provide the material in the way in which it was created. I think that is a wonderful policy, and I would like to think we could continue that, but I'm pretty sure we won't be able to. And when you look at all of the materials that are now being produced in digital form and the multimedia materials, we're not going to be able to play those things back in their artifactual form. So already we're in an environment where we have to reformat to preserve. And one of my challenges to the preservation community is to think about that issue as managers and not as preservation experts. As much as we would love to save everything in exactly the way it was created. I wrote an editorial for the New York Times many years ago now, and the title was, "We Can't Save Everything." And I still believe that. We want to save as much as possible. We can't save everything, and instead of fretting about not saving everything, let's be really smart about what we preserve. And let's put, instead of just saying that it's preservation and access, let's make access as important as preservation. And then figure out, what do we reformat to provide access, make sure the content is available, and then what must we save as artifacts to properly serve the next generation and the one after that. And those are the hardest decisions. I think the preservation staff in all of our institutions have the hardest job of anybody, because they have to look into the future, think really hard about it, and make decisions that will affect the scholarship that can be done in the future. So I'm hoping that that all of you will realize how important the decisions you make really are, and will work with others to make sure that we're thinking deeply about these issues and doing the very best we can. We don't want to be held accountable for too many mistakes. We'll make some, but not too many, I hope. So let me end with a final, I know I don't have too much time. I'd like to urge all of you to go back and read, when we're thinking about, I'm now moving to digital technology and really focusing on preserving digital information. Don Waters, when he was a consultant to the Commission on Preservation and Access, or he was doing this as a funded project, he was still at Yale, and he and John Garrett led a task force and wrote a report called Preserving Digital Information, Report on the Task Force of Archiving Digital Information. It was published by the Commission on Preservation and Access in 1996. And he made the case, it's interesting, I always talk about Don as if he were the only one. There was a task force, a lot of people were involved, but I think Don did the hard thinking on this project. He urged the creation of trusted organizations devoted to digital archiving. We have not seen the development of these trusted organizations. I am concerned that all of our institutions are, and this is pejorative, but I think this is really what we're doing, kind of playing around with digital archiving. We're talking about it, we talk about how hard it is, we issue some reports here and there, but the vision Don had, I think, is the right one. We have organizations devoted to this work. Only one organization has to save digital material. It can be made accessible to everybody. But we have to know, what are the standards? How is it done? What is the plan for moving things from one platform to another? Who's checking to see that it's done properly? Who's checking on loss? And I think we have to go back to that notion and see if there is a way we can develop a national plan to do that. Having all of us work on it a little bit is not going to get us there. So that's my final plea. We have enormous talent in the preservation staffs in all of our institutions. And all of them are very hard pressed to do the work that is needed in the institution. But I think the national institutions really must devote part of their preservation energy to thinking about policies and standards that will serve everybody. And I know that the scientific research that we are doing at the Library of Congress and the scientific research that's being done at other institutions, I think we're doing a good job of extracting what we're learning and making that available to the rest of the country. We need to do the same with the archiving or preservation of digital content. We need to talk about what hasn't worked as well as what has, because that's the only way we're all going to learn as a community and be able to make the kinds of decisions that have to be made. One final word, and that's education. You know, we can't do any of this without seeing to it that the new generation of information professionals will know something about preservation, have an understanding of what's involved, and have a commitment to it. I know that the funding for specific programs in preservation are very hard to fund, and the reason we've seen them falling by the wayside is mostly economic. Part of it's lack of commitment, but it's mostly economic. We may find that what is most important, at least in this interim period and during financial difficulties, is that we must ensure that everyone who's teaching courses in library and information science, archival science, conservation science, make sure that preservation is part of every course that is taught. And that may be the most valuable thing we can do in this interim period. But I think that requires all of us to engage with academic programs and make sure that we are having our voices heard by those who are standing in front of classes and teaching all kinds of things. And we just have to make sure they remember that preservation is a really important part of that whole curriculum. So there you have it. I have unburdened my soul this morning, told you all the things I'm worried about. I'm asking you to join with me in worrying about these things because they are terribly important. And I hope that you will think bigger than you've been thinking, and try to bring the values of preservation and the good managerial sense of a cultural institution that has to continue together so that you are an effective spokesperson for this very important cause. Thank you very much.
You see what I mean about a provocative speaker? And she reminded me of a couple of things that I just wanted to say that I forgot to mention under stewardship. We have emphasized in terms of selection criteria the importance of evaluating value, use, and risk in order to choose what we preserve and what resources we put toward preserving it. And microfilm, master microfilm collection is a perfect example where digitizing that kind of material is about as inexpensive a preservation and access project one can do, and we have an initiative underway looking at that. I'm now going to introduce our second speaker of the morning, Richard Kurin, who is the actually I want to first say that and I'm not going to, to save some time, I won't go through his entire bibliography, which you have in your packets, but Richard served as the director of the Smithsonian Center for Folklife and Cultural Heritage for more than 2 decades at the Smithsonian Institution, which is when I had the pleasure of meeting him and working with him when I was there. And I even remember being in his office advising him on the preservation of the things collected at the Folklife Festival. And so I'm very gratified to see that he now serves as the Smithsonian Institution's Undersecretary for History, Art, and Culture, with responsibilities for most of the museums on the Mall, as well as several other research and outreach programs. And so with that, I think I'm going to let Richard have his turn, because he's another very provocative speaker. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you. It's always good to be at the Library of Congress. I've worked on writing several books and done my research here. And when I first started out, I remember going through actual newspapers, and then it was microfilm, and now it's ProQuest and online, and it saves a lot of time. Let me see, there's a clicker here. I really take heart with what Deanna said, and I think you'll hear some resonances in my own presentation about viewing the purposes and the reasons for preservation and some of the challenges. The Smithsonian, many people think of course, as the museums on the Mall, but we who work at the Smithsonian know that actually some of our biggest outfits are not museums at all and not on the Mall. And so we're certainly across the United States in many ways, but we're also around the world. We work in over 100 countries, and we have 400 employees in Panama. In fact, I offered one island to Deanna to retire to in Panama, where we do tropical research on tropical biology and ecology. And we work in space. We run 6 satellites for NASA. And so we run space telescopes, and we have hundreds of astrophysicists who are collecting data, and that's their collection. The Smithsonian started out back in the, James Smithson, 1826, wrote a will, and he said, "Found in Washington an establishment bearing my name and dedicated to the increase and diffusion of knowledge among men." Now, we think he meant men and women and everybody, but it was a universalistic idea, a very Enlightenment idea, that somehow you would increase knowledge, that was good, and that you would spread it around. And James Smithson really believed in that Enlightenment idea, early Industrial Revolution, the idea that somehow a world filled with knowledge was better than one filled with ignorance. Something we always have to remind ourselves about. At the Smithsonian, after Congress debated for a number of years on what to do with that will and what to do with his fortune, which at that point was worth 1/50th of the US budget, which today would be a $100 billion endowment. Now, Congress lost all the money twice, and had we invested it more wisely, we might have had all that money. But in a very early part of the Smithsonian was dedicated to research. The first secretary, Joseph Henry, the second guy, Spencer Baird, was really the collector. And he saw the idea of collections as something you would learn from and you would utilize in life. And so the collections spanned everything. We had the Smithsonian took on what we called national relics. These were almost saintly collections, the stuff of George Washington and presidents. Natural history collections and specimens, things from the patent office that came to the Smithsonian, from the Temple of Invention downtown that's now the Portrait Gallery and American Art Museum. We even acquired collections of living things. We ended up with those buffalo on the Mall. Why did we end up with buffalo? Because people had skins, animal skins, at the Smithsonian. And the taxidermists needed to know how to stuff the skins accurately. Well, folks in the East Coast hadn't seen many buffalo. They didn't know how to stuff the skins. So they said, well, put some buffalo on the Mall. We'll watch them running around. We'll know how to stuff the skins. That's how we got that collection. That became the National Zoo. Of course, we utilize these collections and think of these collections in a museum sense because of their various kind of importance, their icons, that really connect people with history. So when I take people, and I've taken heads of state, people from many countries, people from this country, and you walk into the Museum of American History and you see that Star-Spangled Banner, you realize that's not a flag, that's the flag. That's when, you know, this building next door to us, that Capitol, was burnt and looted, when our nation was precarious. And so connecting to that flag, and I don't know how many people have experienced that here, but you know, you get a little tingly and realize that that was the flag that came up that morning in dawn's early light when our country was so precarious. We might not have a country. And so the ability to connect with that thing, with something historical like that, is in that presence. I think it's almost magical. I'm an anthropologist. We talk about mana. But that idea of connection, very important. Of course, our collections are important for scientific study. We have zillions of things. Small things. Bugs, I call them. Our scientists don't call them bugs. And of course, we have our collections of art for inspiration, for beauty. Of course, we have the big stuff of technological achievement, like the space shuttle, and we're about to swap this one out for another one. And we have the electronic artistry in our collections that captures the time. The electronic superhighway, it almost seems dated now, but it didn't in the 90s when Namjoon Paik did it. Of course, we have those media collections, things that are not specimens and space shuttles, but the stories and songs and the voices of the past that come to us through different media that Deanna talked about. And so when we have those collections of people recording in the late 1800s as sound technology was developing, and we have those Indian languages, many of which are no longer with us, we have an irreplaceable record of what people sounded like. And as we think of that in the future, when one language is disappearing every week, one language every week, to have those recordings of those languages is something, again, that connects us to our heritage as human beings. Of course, we not only collect the stories of the past, Library of Congress has a partnership with StoryCorps, Smithsonian has a partnership with StoryCorps, we're collecting stories today. And so history goes on, those stories are made, the collections keep coming. We have digitally born collections. As I say, all our astrophysical data is digitally born. And we have tons and tons of it, absolute tons of it, the kind of power. That's the new Magellan telescope that we're building. You could see a person down in the bottom there, little person. Each of those things are 30 feet, each of those mirrors are 35 feet wide. So you can imagine the size of this telescope to peer back into the beginnings of the universe. That will be in Chile. It's being built in Chile. And then we have other collections that are not born digitally, they're just born, like baby pandas. And they are part of our collections. Altogether, we have about 137 million things. That does not count papers, photographs, archives, which run into the billions. We don't even count it. We don't know how to count it. And so the vast majority of our collections are natural history collections. A good bit of our collections are in what we put in the culture and history category. A lot of those are stamps, millions of stamps. And then, of course, artwork. I think, as Diana said, in terms of the issue of preservation and access is an important one to us, and increasingly, you know, we're trying to get our collections out and make them available. So over in the American Art Museum, you go into that Luce Center, it's open access art, open access storage, so our collections are visible on display. You can look at them. In fact, we built a whole museum that's an open access collection, the Hazy Center out at Dulles Airport. Basically, you know, 400 airplanes and space shuttles and other things. Basically, you can go and walk up and touch and see our collections. And we just completed a nice conservation lab with it, so you can actually watch people taking apart stuff and putting it back together and taking care of it. We exhibit our collections frequently, from whales to other things. And I think increasingly we've seen the need to animate collections, to give them meaning, the meaning that they had historically, so that if you take the Greensboro lunch counter, which I think people looking at this audience, some of us with little gray hair, we know the meaning of that. Somebody that was born in, 1995 doesn't know the meaning of that quite. And so how to get at that? So we're increasingly taking our collections, not only putting them on display, but animating them in some way so they could be understood. And of course, we exhibit our living collections. That's what the zoo is. It's just an exhibit. It's making accessible a living collection. Of course, that's animals. On the mall, we have the Folklife Festival, where we do our living exhibition of other animals. They happen to be humans. And we try to show their meaning and their environment, and their cultural ecology. Storage is a big, big issue. Where do you put all this stuff? Where do you put 137 million things? And keep it safe, secure, and accessible. We're always under challenge. Last year we had those snows, we had a snowstorm, we have facilities out at Suitland. The snow got too heavy on the roof, we had one of our buildings collapse. In that was our whole NASA artwork collection. And so literally we had to tunnel under the building, build structures, and get that out. And we've been engaged over the last year in really taking care of the artwork that was damaged. This year we had a Dan Brown moment. What is it called? The Lost Symbol, the last work he did. Terrible book, by the way. Sorry, I didn't say that. I liked his other stuff better. But, Dan Brown in that book, and it's the stuff with the Library of Congress in there, the stuff at the Smithsonian, he blows up one of our facilities. Well, we had in that earthquake our facility out in Suitland, Maryland, that was damaged quite extensively in terms of that earthquake and its threat to our collections. Taking care of these collections, and as I tell people at the Smithsonian, is you can't screw up. And that's the technical term in your job description. I mean, you're taking care of first ladies' gowns and astronauts' spacesuits and space, I mean, you can't mess up. And so there's a heavy-duty responsibility for taking care of the stuff of the institution. And that requires continual care and also upgrading, of course, of professional methods. And so I love the Star Spangled Banner story because when it first came to the Smithsonian in the early 1900s, in order to take care of it and preserve it, we had seamstresses working in the castle to put in 1.8 million stitches onto a backing to hold the flag in place because the worry was it was going to be in tatters and come apart. And when we, thanks to the great support of Ralph Lauren, Save America's Treasures, and others, we spent about $30 million taking care of the flag in the 1990s. And what did we have to do? We had to take out those 1.8 million stitches that had been sewn in 100 years before. So, as you all in the conservation and preservation field know, sometimes your methods at one point that seem quite accurate and the right thing to do become undone later on. And I'm sure for the people in this room and the people watching, there will be people a generation or two from now who will take out your stitches as well. And of course, as said, we have the digitally new stuff that taking care of, things that are media heavy, we have, and I'm sure the Library of Congress does, shelves and shelves of the old equipment so you can play the stuff in. I don't know how many of you in the audience still have your old 8-track players. Mine is long gone. But you got to keep it around because how else are you going to have access to it unless you, again, digitize it, migrate it to different platforms to take care of it. We're trying to figure it out. When it comes with the artwork, digitally created art, time-based art, it's very challenging in terms of keeping things going. There's new things always coming to the Smithsonian and our collections, and it has to. Sometimes there's new discoveries, and that raises issues. We had an issue earlier this year over shipwrecked, an ancient shipwreck from 800 AD off the coast of Indonesia, issues about the ethics of acquisition and display of that material. But there's a lot of things out there that are very old that are always being discovered and are coming into collections. At the same time, and I wanted to have a shot, we had something new for our Natural History Museum last year. For those of you who, I think it was in Lorton, Virginia, where a meteorite crashed through the doctor's office, that came to the Smithsonian. That was like, a gift from God, I guess. I don't know, to the Smithsonian. But we get that. But also Lonnie Bunch and his staff at our National Museum of African American History and Culture are doing collection sessions all over the country, collecting things, so that he could represent the African American experience. And just recently acquired a Nat Turner Bible, for example, that really is very insightful in terms of understanding that period of our history. So, we can't say history stopped. Now, this creates a tremendous tension. And I think of, again, what Deanna said in terms of, you go before Congress and they say, well, why are you getting all this new stuff? Why can't you take care of what you got? Right? Well, because history doesn't stop. And you can't just do that. We're continually finding new life for old collections. And this is always another vexing thing in the museum world, particularly, because you don't know what the significance of the things you're collecting necessarily is at the time you collect them. Or you might think they're significant for one thing and not another. So when we acquired our bird collection, okay, this was largely done in the 19th century, the idea was to understand speciation, post-Darwin, how did these various species and breeds of birds develop? And we acquired a wonderful, wonderful collection that would give us almost an encyclopedia of avian life. It was before the invention of airplanes. What's this collection used now for? Well, the head of the collection is a woman named Carla Dove, I kid you not. Whenever there's a plane strike in the United States, you remember Miracle on the Hudson? Okay, so you get the birds hit the plane. What happens is the FAA collects the bird pate. It's a polite way of saying it, from the engine. They send it to the Smithsonian. It goes to that lady there. They then use the collection as a way of referencing what was the species or the subspecies or so on that hit the plane, that hit the jet. Then you can identify it. Then if you know the species and the breed, you then know how to prevent those bird strikes in the future. That is, if they're Canadian geese, we always blame it on the Canadians. If they're Canadian geese, then you're going to play loud, country western music to scare off the geese, or you introduce predators, or you do whatever you have to do. So a collection has a significance today that Spencer Baird and his folks, when he made that collection, never would have guessed. They didn't have airplanes. Who would have wondered? And so, you could get somebody prioritizing that collection, and, in 1899, before the Wright brothers, who says, what do we need all these birds for? And then you would never have that use for it decades later. Of course, we've dealt with our collections in standard ways, publishing collections in print. I kind of like this one. This is Frida Kahlo's Love Letters. And, we have collections at the Smithsonian of everything. But also, of course, sound. Woody Guthrie, a collection that we share with the library in terms of documenting his life and sound, to jazz. And the idea of putting music out, putting film out, putting images out, publishing our stuff, very conventional, and we've done it for a long time, and it's a great way to get the items from the collection out. Of course, digitizing the collections is really something that's happened over the last I'd say, 15 years or so, 20 years or so with increasing vigor. Out of our collections, 137 million things, we think we've digitized about 19 million. That's a lot of low-hanging fruit, too. And so the idea of how do we get to the rest and how much of the rest is really worth digitizing and for what is a question that we're asking every day. Flat stuff for us in the museum business is a little easier than three-dimensional stuff. And the idea is digitize stuff and then send it out. So this is another form. Instead of a museum, your museum could be on your laptop, so on. And our American art people, I love our American art people, very inventive. How do they get them? They take their stuff, they have their digitized holdings, they have their exhibits, and then they basically teach classes around the world. They got a contract with the Department of Defense. Anytime you could get, I don't know who's here from Defense Department, anytime we can get Defense Department to pay for culture, victory. And so we teach art from the basement of the museum to kids on Army bases in Japan and around the world and get our collections out. Very inventive program. And of course, increasingly making things available on the web so that people can have access. to our collection. I think we felt at the Smithsonian that, and sometimes we even fight with our own auditors. Our auditors say, well, take care of your collections and make sure you inventory them and count them and do that. And I say, what are we going to do? Take everything out of our storage, line it up on the mall, and 1, 2, 3, 4. That would take a long time. I can't count to 137 million. How do we balance that idea of inventory and taking account for our stuff, the technical term for our collections, with the issue of making it accessible to people? And I think we've invested really in saying, look, the collections are going to draw support and understanding if they are accessible. So the kind of division between the two is much more porous and blurry, I think, than it ever was before, at least for us. Now, making these things available, we took, actually, I took heart in the Library of Congress's work with Flickr. I thought the Library of Congress did a great job putting photographs on Flickr and then having people crowdsource it. Because you don't have enough curators to identify, like, 10 million photographs. And so with the Smithsonian, we faced a little issue with some of our curators because the idea of putting it out and having other people work with it, that's what we do. We curate this stuff. But we did get stuff out and increasingly putting things out on Flickr, on Facebook, getting things out in various social media so people can work with the material, use it, comment upon it, and maybe even add knowledge to it. We did it with sound. When I first did it with sound with our Folkways collection, I couldn't get any money from the Smithsonian. I had to actually, Paul Allen gave me some money, Rockefeller gave me some money. I actually took a loan. I actually took a loan from the Rockefeller Foundation to enable us to put our stuff, this was before iTunes, to actually put our stuff online so people would have access to our musical collections. Increasingly, we're seeing support. The Terra Foundation has been very, very good for our art archives, our archives of American art, in terms of taking stuff out of the files. So you'd have to come to Washington or New York or Detroit, take stuff out of the files, find it. Now you can just go online. It's a pleasure. And so making available, I think for them, it's about 4 million files, dossiers, letters, notebooks of artists, and so on. One of the ambitious projects we have is called the Encyclopedia of Life. There's tens of millions of dollars invested in this. It's a big partnership between the Smithsonian, the Field Museum, Harvard, the British Museum. We've now made a partnership with the Library of Alexandria. We're making partnerships with people around the world. The idea is a very simple one. Every species gets a web page. And the idea is to use the power of that to compile and bring together various source material. So you don't have to go through 500 pages of Google to figure out what makes sense and what's not. And the idea is to bring historical literature, bring literature in different languages, and bring it to one page, one portal where you have it. And then people can comment on it. And then when my wife is out with her class doing a field trip, and she notices that the two-eyed swallow whatever, I'm going to get in trouble because I'm an anthropologist, I don't mean anything about bird people, but when she does a thing and they have an observation, they could send it into the page. And then you could build that up over time, and then actually people participate, and then you can figure out that, wow, we have some evidence of climate change or not, because they're migrating down to Falls Church, Virginia, or they're not at the right time, and so on. So the idea is to make it very participatory, a portal both for scientists and the public to utilize. And again, that's been a way of getting a lot of our volumes from our library, technical, scientific volumes from our library, digitized in a way that maybe we wouldn't have been able to get the money if we didn't have a sexy outreach, scientific research, and public accessibility program to pull it along. Now, digitizing has its challenges. You got to digitize dinosaurs. It's not just like one photograph. You can't put it on a flat copier. You need ladders and scaffolding, and you need a lot to be able to do it. Similarly with all the stuff in the jars, millions of specimens in the jars. How do you digitize that? And you don't, as my counterpart, the Undersecretary of Science, says, we don't have to digitize every shrimp in the jar. One might do. So, you know, these are the things we're playing with. We've actually done very well with stamps. The Postal Museum, God bless them, has done a great job. They got 6 million stamps. They have 4 curators. Well, it'll take them, I don't know, about 40 lifetimes to actually put together the metadata to actually document everything we know about every one of those stamps. So what have they done? They've created a community of philatelists, I need to get that word right, philatelists, who then, in a refereed way, do the research on the stamp, send it back. They have a very great site called Arago, and it's really a kind of professional crowdsourced site. So they can explicate their collection, but also it gets the collection in the hands of people that care most about it. As Bran Ferrin from Disney Imagineering said to us one time, he says, Richard, everything you have in that collection is a community. There's a railroad, you know, there's railroad people, there's stamp people, there's flag people, there's uniform people, there's button people, there's comic book people, there's everything people. Each one of those are a community that you can mobilize, and if you get your collection out and make it available and accessible, they'll give you the support. And we've seen that. Now, of course, we've used the same digital technology to enhance the museum experience. So at the Hirshhorn, those of you who've been at the Hirshhorn, you know, you got a big white wall and you got one painting on it, and it's all purple, and you're trying to understand the significance of it. Well, but now you have your digital phone, and you can, you know, point your app at stuff, and you can figure out what's the whole repertoire of stuff behind that one painting on the wall, and what do the artists say about it, and so on. So we found the drive to get the collections out have actually made and enhanced the museum exhibition. This is reaching even more height with the Google Art Project. So you can go in and see things at the Ferriero Gallery that I've never seen. You can't see with the naked eye. That now with the camera, you can manipulate, you can have your own collection, but you can go into detail about brushstrokes. You can get closer than you can get in person and see things that aren't there. That are there, but you couldn't, you know what I mean. Sometimes we do see things that aren't there. And we've used our collections increasingly for online games, blogs, and webinars. So the idea is to engage and enhance that engagement with the public so that our collections can indeed enliven life, educate, inspire, and do the very same things that James Smithson saw them doing. And it also means you can manipulate collections. And I did a book on the Hope Diamond. I'm pretty fond of it. You know, but once it's digitized, you know, people can play around with it. You can design your own Hope Diamond. You can design different settings. In fact, we asked the American people to design new settings. We even held a contest about designing new settings. They were all digitized settings. And somebody won, and we had a new setting. And we actually made it. Harry Winston made the new setting. I mean, so, you know, these things play amongst themselves. This is one I like, one of my favorite ones. This is a new one we just, one of our biologists invented over in natural history called Leaf Snap. Basically, you use your phone there. You take a picture of a leaf, any leaf down the street, leaf up the block. Take a picture of the leaf. It all of a sudden references our whole collection of leaves. So now if you're with your kid, you can look intelligent. Oh, that is a poplar from da-da-da-da-da-da, with the scientific name, whatever, it grows in there. So basically, we're using our collection as the back end, right, of this application so that you can understand your environment. You could even map it. You can get all the information about it. Then we could take that scientifically and see, oh, well, a leaf's changing. Are they falling off sooner? What are people documenting? So people all of a sudden become mini researchers. Again, enhancing the value of the collection. I think what we've seen more and more, and I've seen in my lifetime at the Smithsonian, I've worked there for about 35 years, is that this porosity between preservation and access, between education and research, a lot of these boundaries are breaking down. Even the boundary between the museum. So is the leaf that you snap in the museum, in the Smithsonian, or not? Well, it is, and it isn't. The world's becoming our collection. The world is a museum. And we're seeing that. We just opened an exhibit the other day at the UN General Assembly building on design for the other 90%, where the folks in the Cooper U are looking at design, not only bringing design into the museum, where it's always been, designing from jet engines to Edison's light bulbs, but looking at design in the world and saying that's part of the museum. The wall that we saw there is not there anymore. This, a favela in Brazil, it's now part of the Cooper Hewitt collection. I guess it's in an exhibit. I mean, and I think as we see the world more as the collection or within the purview of what we steward, what we deal with, what we hope to preserve. I work very closely with Eryl Wentworth here, just saw Katie Wagner from the Smithsonian who was down. After the earthquake in Haiti, you had a whole cultural heritage that was both in galleries and libraries and archives, but also in people's private galleries and homes, in churches and so on. And all that in the earthquake was severely damaged and endangered. And in Haiti, where cultural heritage is so important, it's kind of what people have and holds them together, gives them the strength and resilience to survive. It gives people meaning. It's their lives. And so the fact that we came in and you had a number of US organizations come in, NGOs, agencies, people from around the world, and Haitians, banding together indeed to save, conserve, curate, and so on, the collections that were around them, that were meaningful to their life. We've now been able to treat over 30,000 items, which is pretty amazing. So, and train over 100 Haitians in doing that. So I think, there people say, well, the Smithsonian, aren't you supposed to do that in the museum? Well, if we don't do it in real life, then it'll never make it to the museum. And not everything that's important to people is on our shelves or in our cases. So I think, just basically summing up, because I think I'm at the end here, I don't think there's much surprise about some of the challenges here. Basic storage continues to be a challenge. Care at the Smithsonian only is, a relatively small percentage of our collections we feel are really adequately stored. We have continuing problems. And you still have, with some legacy collections and legacy storage spaces, issues of hazardous material and other things. You don't have enough security people. We have legacy records, so not all of our records are inventoried in digital means, which means the auditors don't like it, but that's what we have because it's 137 million things. Can't switch over. We've lost personnel, managers, conservators, curators, people to take care. We talk, and I don't know if you use the same terminology at the library, orphan collections. Who's going to be their mommy and daddy? Who's going to take care of these collections and speak for them? The ability to loan them, study them, move them around. Increasingly harder to do. We have an affiliates program with 168 museums around the country that all want to borrow stuff from us. How to get it out of the museum and over to San Antonio or Los Angeles or Madison, Wisconsin. It's not easy because you need the people to do it. Assessment and prioritization. A lot of our collections people hate to do this. Managers, and I agree again with Deanna, managers' perspective is a little different. I need to get money from Congress. I need to sell this. I need some assessment and some prioritization of what's the most important things to do so I can make that case. If everything is everything and everything is the same, it's much harder to make the case. And so we're doing much more of that at the Smithsonian, how to get to scale and digitalization, how to make our stuff accessible to specialists in the public, how to generate the vast amount of metadata that we need to explicate our collections. And then we run into continuing issues of provenance and ethics, and how to deal with that, with taking into things to the collection. But also at the Smithsonian, we give out tens of thousands of things through repatriation programs. So in handling the collection, then you have deaccessioning. So, you have big issues here. And then, of course, as I think digitization opens up a whole new world of how to engage our publics, specialists, and others in terms of them sharing our enthusiasm for the meaning of our collections. And of course, to wrap it into one big bundle, we can do all of this if folks just ponied up and gave us the money we need to do it. Thank you very much.
Well, that's a lot of food for thought, of course, and it actually made me homesick for the 20 years I spent at the Smithsonian doing, again, value, risk, and assessment surveys. And I remember the nail people, the community of the nail people. They only cared about nails. And so I think your use of social networking for that is really a wonderful, wonderful way of doing it to build these virtual collections. We have about 5 minutes for our break. And so, again, I'd like to thank the morning speakers. It was a wonderful way to start the day. And we'll start again promptly at 10:30. And so if you have questions, just come up and ask the speakers. But thank you all again.
So what I would very much like to do here is to introduce our next speaker. who is Stephanie Toothman from the National Park Service. Stephanie is the Associate Director of Cultural Resources and Science at the National Park Service. She oversees support for the cultural resource management for 394 park units and for the National Historic Preservation Partnership programs and partners, including state, federal, tribal, and local agencies, and public and private partners. Prior to her current appointment, she served as the Chief of Cultural Resource Programs for the National Park Service Pacific West Region. She received her bachelor's degree, magna cum laude, from Smith College and her master's and PhD in American Civilization from the University of Pennsylvania, where she was the University Fellow. I was very proud of my time at the National Park Service, and I was very proud of the camaraderie of that program. And I will give you the unofficial motto of the National Park Service, which is, "We don't eat sunsets, but we sure try."
And I want to say to Diane, we're still trying, particularly in this budget climate, of trying to figure out how that works. I want to thank the Library of Congress Preservation Program for putting together this symposium and for inviting us to participate. I also want to tell Dr. Marcum that she's accomplishing her goal, at least for me personally, in educating the managers, because it's been almost 30 years since I was trained as a curator at the Philadelphia Museum of Art, and I'm getting a great refresher course today. And I also want to thank Dr. Kurin for covering a lot of the collections issues, because although we are kind of a runner-up to them in terms of number of collections, 127 million items in archival materials last count, and we're not sure that's an accurate count. When you embark on a big collections backlog project, they start pulling things out of drawers that never were accounted for before. But we are trying a number of the strategies that he described, but we certainly can take some lessons and would look forward to collaborating with you in the future. I'm also pleased to represent Director John Jarvis and the Parks and Historic Preservation Programs of the National Park Service this morning. And I want to acknowledge Ann Mason, who's sitting in the audience, whose hard work in both educating me on where we are on these programs. I've only been on this job for a year, is reflected in some of the comments that I have today. So to begin, on Founders Day, August 25th, 2011, we celebrated the 95th anniversary of the National Park Service. And to mark that and to look towards the future, Director John Jarvis announced the call to action, which put forth his vision and our vision collectively of the National Park Service in the 21st century. Oops. Central to this vision is using technology in new and exciting ways to make NPS relevant to the American people. New websites, new exhibit technology, new interpretive and educational strategies, all build on the initial vision of our late former director, Roger Kennedy, who was a leading advocate for using the web and other technologies to bring our programs to a wider audience. The National Park Service mission, set forth in the Organic Act of 1916, has been the same for the last 95 years, but technology is greatly enhancing the way that that mission is being fulfilled. Like many of the institutions presenting here today, the National Park Service has been digitizing various materials and collections within its holdings in order to make the materials more readily available to the American public. I'd like to focus on a couple of our programs, but I want to emphasize that this effort goes across both our park stewardship and our partnership programs. And the two programs I want to focus on most specifically are the National Register of Historic Places and the Historic Documentation Programs, the Historic American Building Survey, the Historic American Engineering Record, and the Historic American Landscape Survey. The current effort to digitize the National Register of Historic Places is the largest of its kind within the National Park Service. The National Register is our nation's official listing of significant historic properties. At present, our count is approximately 87,000 listings, which includes more than 1 million individual properties. Currently, for the last decade, I should say, the National Register has been digitizing the nominations that are produced to list historic properties. We started off slowly. We got $4 million from Congress in 2007, and at present we have about 40 states ready and posted on the NPS Focus site. These nominations detail the historic significance of properties and include written reports, photographic prints, and maps showing locations and boundaries of historic properties. Prior to scanning, the only way to provide access to this information for people who needed it was either to go to their state repositories in the state historic preservation offices, come to Washington, or send in a request that was laboriously filled by photocopying and mailed out. When disaster strikes, such as Hurricane Irene or the recent spill in the Gulf, knowing what historic properties are listed and where they are is essential to protecting them and minimizing damage. Having digitized copies of the nominations available via the internet will make and is making protecting these resources easier in the future. Within 24 hours of Hurricane Irene coming up the coast, we were responding to requests from the state offices and federal agencies for information on what properties in the hurricane's path were on the National Register. Unfortunately, we are only in the planning stages for digitizing the maps within the collection, although we are working on methodologies to accomplish this. Nor have we converted the locational data on the maps in any kind of systematic way into geospatial data. So following a disaster, the ability to quickly access, share, and use cultural resource geospatial data is also critical to any coherent response strategy in order to protect human safety and preserve, again, important historic resources. Another one of our programs, the Cultural Resources Geographic Information Systems Program, we're going to call it CRGIS to shorten it up here today, is dedicated to developing and fostering the use of GIS, and I should get back onto that slide, for documenting, analyzing, and managing cultural resources. CRGIS created a strategy to help FEMA to meet its legal obligations under the National Historic Preservation Act to protect cultural resources eligible for the National Register, as well as other significant archaeological and tribal resources during the cleanup and response following Hurricanes Katrina and Rita. CRGIS produced a cultural resource disaster response methodology out of that experience that can be applied for other types of disasters. They also created cultural resource spatial data transfer standards that have been approved service-wide in 2010 and will be also certified for more general use in federal agencies, I believe, this year. Having these data sets again facilitates collaboration, planning, and protection of cultural resources within and beyond our boundaries and meets our responsibilities under the National Preservation Act, Historic Preservation Act, to provide the standards nationally for historic preservation. Geospatial data is being used to identify historic properties and resources threatened by climate change. This data will help us prioritize preservation treatments and documentation to help mitigate climate change impacts such as rising sea levels. And I believe Dr. Marcum talked about the need to know what we have and to be able to prioritize when we don't have the money to do everything that we'd like to. We're developing a triage formula for assessing our resources and developing some priorities for what we can and cannot take care of, and documenting the resources is a very important part of that, because that may be our only strategy for saving the information that these resources contain. We've moved the Cape Hatteras Lighthouse once. It's unlikely we'll have the money to do it again. Digitization has allowed the National Register to proactively manage risks to the physical collection as well, reducing wear and tear on the nominations and safeguarding the primary documents from potential loss. The scanning process has allowed the National Register to begin shipping the digitized portions of the records off-site to more secure storage at the Federal Records Center, furthering the preservation of this valuable documentation. Several years ago, the National Register changed its photographic standards, allowing digital pigment and carbon inkjet prints to be submitted in place of traditional wet prints from 35mm negatives. The inkjet prints are thought to meet or exceed the current minimal acceptable permanency standard for the National Register. The quality of the prints has actually increased through this process, since prior to accepting inkjet prints, many were printed on resin-coated paper, which lasts only a few decades before we experience significant fading and color shifting. The National Register never required the negative needed to reproduce the images as part of the submission. Now, however, with the acceptance of digital images, that allows the National Register to acquire color TIFF images used to create the prints. Previously, because color images did not meet our permanency standards, only black and white prints were acceptable. Now we have those color images, and they're enhancing our website, our publications, and our educational materials. We're trying to embrace the paperless office concept as well, and we are, quite frankly, struggling with a process to develop a paperless submission process that will meet all of the requirements of creating not only a permanent record of the historical resources worthy of preservation, but also supporting the numerous legal issues associated with National Register documentation. Currently, nominations are approved by the SHPO, and for those of you who aren't in the historic preservation business, the state historic preservation offices, and then the paper nomination, photographic prints, and maps are shipped to the National Register program to be approved and signed by the keeper of the National Register. State offices bear most of the production costs of nominations, and they're concerned about the costs of materials and mailing. Like all of us, they are particularly being hard hit right now in terms of their budgets, and we're very concerned about our ability to be able to maintain and support the 55 state offices and territories. So any effort that we can make to ease their workload is definitely an important issue for us. One hurdle that has proven difficult to overcome is creating an electronic signature required for the document to be legally binding that can be permanently preserved. Currently, we have not identified a good option for the permanent digital signature, and we would certainly welcome in any discussion today some suggestions if people have been able to tackle this issue. Also, since the inception of the National Register in 1966, each nomination has required a USGS quad map with location and boundaries of the historic property clearly drawn. Many of the nominations have large-scale detailed maps in addition to the quad maps that indicate boundaries of the historic district. It's not clear yet how we're going to transfer this geographic information, how it will be submitted, how to transmit large digital files from the SHPO to the National Park Service in an efficient and secure method. And once the digital files are at the National Park Service, we face another problem, the long-term storage of permanent federal records. Paper is a known quantity. However, several digital file types are included in a single case file, which again offers its own challenges. We don't want to split the files up. We want them managed as a unit. We are in the initial stages of exploring with National Archives staff some possible long-term solutions to these challenges, as well as working collaboratively to finish the digitization process. I have to say, standing back, observing what has happened in terms of our efforts to digitize the program, that I think it would have been wise on our part to have reached out to the library and the National Archives much sooner, because I'm not sure at this point whether what we've done in our own self-directed way is even currently meeting current standards. But we're hoping it is. But we would like to take our responsibilities and make sure that it's at the highest professional levels, and that's why we're very glad to be at the symposium and to make the contacts that hopefully will help us move forward. The other major preservation program that I wanted to talk about today is the group of programs known as the Historic American Building Survey, the Historic American Engineering Record, and the Historic American Landscape Survey. These programs have changed dramatically in the last few decades because of technological innovations. Dating back to 1933, the Historic American Building Survey is our nation's oldest federal preservation program. It was intended, in the words of Charles E. Peterson, one of the founders, to be a complete resume of the builder's art. HABS was joined by the Historic American Engineering Record in 1969 and by the Historic American Landscape Survey in 2000s. These programs set the standard for documentation of historic structures and landscapes through the Secretary's standards for architectural and engineering documentation. Their documentation must meet 4 standards. The documentation must adequately explicate and illustrate the significance of the resource. It must be verifiable. It must be durable and reproduced on materials that meet a 500-year permanency standard, and it must be clearly presented. Documentation consists of interpretive and measured architectural drawings, large format photographic film negatives with fiber-based prints, historical reports, and field notes that contain the measurements taken in the field that are used to produce the drawings. From the very beginning, HABS was a unique public-private partnership among the American Institute of Architects, which serves as an advocacy group for the program, the National Park Service, which produces much of the documentation, maintains the standards, and reviews and approves the documentation produced by others. And finally, the Library of Congress, which houses the collection and provides public access to the materials. The HABS Hair House documentation process has resulted in the same archival products, drawings on vellum or mylar, photographic film negatives, and historical reports on archival bond paper for more than 78 years. And while these products have stayed the same, the process for creating these products and how they are presented to the public has changed dramatically. Since the 1990s, the Library of Congress, with the cooperation of the National Park Service, the grateful cooperation of the National Park Service, has digitized and made the documentation available via the prints and photographs online catalog. The initial digitization was done by the library with a grant funded by Shell Oil. The hair collection was chosen because of its great educational value and illustration of America's industrial heritage. The National Park Service is now providing much of the documentation to the Library of Congress already digitized, eliminating the need for much of the scanning. Computer-aided drafting, or CAD, allows the drawings to be converted to TIFF directly from CAD, and word processing documents are converted to PDF and then to TIFF, eliminating the need for scanning while achieving images that are superior to scanned images. The online collection provides access and has opened up new audiences to a collection that was previously only available in the prints and photographs reading room, or again by a very laborious process of ordering your photos and having them printed and then having them mailed out to you. That's part of my early career that I remember. The collection on the Library of Congress website currently gets 50,000 visitors a month, viewing more than 800,000 pages within the collection. This is a dramatic change that illustrates the power of digitization when compared to the approximately 3,000 visitors that visited the reading room in an average year prior to digitization. The online access has also allowed the collection to begin to be moved from the Library of Congress reading room on Capitol Hill to storage at Fort Meade, reducing wear and tear on the collection, and further preserving it for the future. The programs are increasingly facing pressure from commercial photographers and CRM management firms who produce a significant amount of the documentation for the collection. They are advocating very strongly that we accept born digital photography in lieu of film. Digital photography presents many challenges, not the least of which is that standards for digital large format equivalents do not exist. And Dr. Marcum's discussion of the early stages of microfilming standards brings to mind the same situation that we're facing now. And I understand there was also a school for scanning, which to me sounded like a restoration comedy, but again, a good collaboration on how we should be dealing with these issues. Creating standards certainly is an appropriate role for our programs, but lack of standards within the professional photography community for born digital processes, software, and equipment are reasons for much caution. Digital photography has yet to meet the quality of large format, nor can a digital file achieve the same image integrity and endurance of a negative. The mission of our programs is to create a permanent record of our nation's built environment, and film has demonstrated its longevity. Habs film negatives from the 30s are still in wonderful condition 78 years after their capture. It is still unclear how permanent digital photography will be, and with a standard of 500 years that we work with, digital photography must first demonstrate its capacity for longevity. Digital cameras are far more expensive than traditional view cameras, and rapid advances in digital technology require the frequent replacement of equipment in order to keep current. The cost of capture of a digital image is small compared to storage cost for the digital materials, which is exponentially more expensive than film. Film is currently inexpensive, and with the acceptance of digital inkjet prints into the collection over a year ago, the required prints have become easier to create. Digital archival storage is much more expensive than analog film storage, and the brunt of this cost will potentially be taken on by the Library of Congress. The library has stated, I understand, that you are willing to take on this additional cost, but with almost 290,000 photographs in a collection which continues to grow, not only is storage cost a concern, but the task of migrating this media over time so that it can continue to be acceptable as technology advances is also a major future cost concern. And I know those of us with gray in our hair have reports that were done in weighing and earlier that we can only look at wistfully and hope that somewhere has a machine to read them. So we've learned our lessons just within our lifetime of how inaccessibility can creep up on you if you don't have the means to keep up with the transference. The rapid emergence of new technologies such as CAD presents new and exciting opportunities for the National Park Service. Initially, as we mentioned, all HABS drawings were executed by hand on vellum. We still accession a few sets of drawings executed by hand each year, in most cases by students who are learning the techniques, but today most are completed using CAD software. We've used CAD since the mid-1980s, incorporating the new features of CAD as they've become available. This spring, we transmitted the first ever archival color inkjet drawing for the Western Maryland Railway Cumberland Extension, an aerial view of the railway that was created from LiDAR data. Habs Hair House consulted with the library to determine that the color drawings created using pigment and carbon inkjet printers could be incorporated into the collection, and thus we were able to transmit it. The most dramatic change in the drawing production process has been the measurement of structures and landscapes. Previously, structures were measured by hand with tape, plumb bobs, and measuring combs. We began laser scanning over a decade ago. This process uses laser beams that measure an object using reflectivity, creating an extremely accurate point cloud of geometric samples of the surface of an object. And I'm going to admit right here, I'm way beyond my technological depth, and Ann is here to help. Laser scanning allows Habs House to accurately record structures that are very large or not readily accessible because they are difficult to reach, dangerous, or otherwise pose problems in measuring. Currently, we use a Leica Scantation 2, which may create heartbeat in some of you, but which can measure large structures relatively quickly and can result in significant savings in field times. However, and again, I don't want to sound negative, but just like other aspects of digital photography, laser scanning has its drawbacks, and we need to be aware of those and dealing with them before we go wholeheartedly in adopting it. It cannot record parts of structures that the scanner cannot see, such as their tops or undersides or areas obscured by foliage or neighboring structures. As you can see, the scans of the Statue of Liberty, the scanner missed large areas of the crown that were in shadow, giving the appearance that the top of the crown is floating in space, unconnected to the rest of the statue. Since the scanner records by reflectivity, it also has difficulty with structures that are dark in color. The undefined edge of the laser point cloud also makes it difficult to adequately capture architectural details and other small-scale elements. Therefore, hand measuring has not been eliminated and cannot be eliminated. The laser scanner and hand measuring working in tandem, with hand measuring providing missing elements that the laser scanner cannot capture, is the way that we are proceeding at this point. We can also use the hand measuring techniques to discern construction techniques and building materials that the scanner cannot. Generally, the scanner is also not ideal for recording smaller interior spaces. Thus, in the creation of floor plans, it's generally more efficient to hand measure these areas. Also, incorporating laser scanning into the documentation process has created another problem, which we've yet to overcome: how to archive the scanned data long term. With traditional hand measuring, extensive field notes of each structure are created, and the field notes, as well as the laser scan data, often contain information that is not incorporated into the final archival drawing. The field notes also provide verifiability of the drawings, which is an essential part of meeting the standards. The wide range of proprietary software and hardware required to render the point cloud data makes it difficult to archive, and we, as well as the library, have expressed concerns about including this data in the collection. From my responsibilities as steward of park collections, I've visited or been notified that a number of our parks are trying to use laser scan data in their preservation of historic structures. El Morro National Monument, for example, is using LiDAR to track loss and definitions of inscriptions on inscription rock. But this data is at risk if the digital storage problem is not solved or if archival documentation is not created from the data. Many of our parks can barely get the internet because of their remote connections. Many of them can barely keep up. We've been to parks which still are running 386 computers. So when they are sold the proposition by some of the folks who are doing laser scanning now that they can do this, we immediately run into the problem that they don't have the capacity to maintain the data. And we also do not have the intellectual property rights for the data or the ability to control how it's used. So in addition to not having the IT infrastructure, who controls access and interpretation of the scanned data, how it's used, if it's not clear whose property it is and that we can maintain control of the files is a big issue for us. At Effigy Mounds, we've also made use of LiDAR mapping, and in 2000 we mapped the mound's landscape, revealing previously undetected mounds seen here. Are they seen here in the red circles, or did we have changed? I think we changed the slide here. Oh, I can't see it on mine. Okay, great. As part of the project, mounds were stabilized by filling in old looter pits, and the eroding river bank was stabilized to halt erosion of several large mounds. The scanning allowed for a greater understanding of the entire landscape and provided new insights to the mound building culture of Northeast Iowa. Also, in a recent project sponsored by the Department of State, our architects, Dana Lockett and Paul Davidson, traveled to Afghanistan to document 2 minarets dating from the 11th and 12th century. And unfortunately, we don't have the picture of them doing this in full body armor being guarded by a whole group of tanks. So it was quite an experience for them. They used laser scans along with HDR panophotography to form the basis for the documentation of the existing condition of the towers to help with the conservation and preservation for the future. And they made presentations of their work at Kabul University. It was clear to them that in their meetings with Ghazni officials that the people of Afghanistan, just as people all over the world, want to preserve their cultural heritage. And this was why we made the trip, but whether or not, again, like our own parks, they're going to have the capacity anytime soon to really engage in this process. I think that we also should be looking at teaching them the basic skills of hand drawing and hand documentation, because I think that's a more realistic technology in terms of the immediate future. Habs Hair House has also recently started HDR photography and panophotography as part of the measurement process. We apply photographic, again, this is a little technical, RGB data to the 3D point clouds, creating a more realistic image of the structure. This photography, HD photography, helps define the edges of objects, such as window jambs and other architectural details. When HDR and panophotography is applied to the laser scan point cloud data, a mesh can be created that links the points together, relating them to one another, creating a vector data. A skin can then be applied to the mesh that creates a virtual 3D object, and this 3D object can be used to create drawings in CAD to produce the traditional drawing on vellum or mylar, but it also can be used to create virtual 3D structures. Shenandoah National Park recreated a 3D virtual landscape of Camp Fetcher, a civilian conservation camp that no longer exists above ground. And they're using a combination of satellite imagery, historic maps, and archaeological excavations to determine the location of the original buildings. They then have used the historic photographs as a guide to create 3D models that they're using in wayside exhibits and presenting the history of this camp online. All the projects that I've shared with you today and some of the concerns that we've expressed are ones that I think we all share in terms of those concerns. How do we have the standards? How do we have the infrastructure? How do we maintain this information going forward? They all, however, the projects are embracing the principles that the director's call to action put forward, which is we need to bring the National Park Service into the 21st century in a way that makes the rich resources that we steward in the parks and that we help communities throughout the nation protect, preserve, and educate. So I want to thank you again for sharing with us. And again, I've found the symposium very valuable in coming away with some ideas for future collaboration with some of you. So thank you very much.
I Our next speaker is David Ferriero, the Archivist of the United States. Previously, he served as the Andrew W. Mellon Director of the New York Public Libraries. Among his responsibilities at the library was the development of the library's digital strategy, which currently encompasses partnerships with Google and Microsoft, a website that reaches more than 25 million unique users annually, and a digital library of more than 750,000 images that may be accessed free of charge by any user around the world. Before joining the library in 2004, he was university librarian and vice provost for library affairs at Duke University, where he raised more than $50 million to expand and renovate the university's libraries, and was responsible for instructional technology initiatives, including overseeing Duke's Center for Instructional Technology. Prior to that, he served as Associate Director for Public Services and Acting Co-Director of Libraries at Massachusetts Institute of Technology. He served in the Navy during the Vietnam War and earned bachelor's and master's degrees in English literature from Northeastern University and a master's degree from Simmons College of Library and Information Science. Please welcome the Archivist of the United States.
Thank you, Diane, and thank you for the invitation to participate this morning. What you didn't say is that I am a preservation junkie. So let me just fill you in on my preservation background. I started shelving books in the library at MIT in 1965, and I worked for a woman who was the Associate Humanities Librarian who was very much interested in preservation and conservation. We didn't have a program there, but we had George Cunha in the neighborhood. George, for those of you who don't know, started the Northeast Document Conservation Center. He was known as Captain Cunha during my time, and we brought him onto campus to teach us what to do. So I got really firsthand experience in preservation techniques that would just shock you today. I oiled leather bindings. I encapsulated things in plastic that you would never do, laminated things, but used that experience to help form the very first preservation program at MIT during the 70s, and Jennifer Banks became the very first preservation librarian. I moved on to Duke University, which had no preservation program at all. It just shocked me. Incredible collection, but no preservation program. So I was able, during that campaign, to raise money to create the preservation program and recruit Winston Atkins, who is still there as the preservation librarian, and then moved on to the New York Public Library, which has had a stunning history in preservation and conservation, and had an opportunity to kind of help rebuild that program with Evelyn Frangakis and her staff. And I think Evelyn's in the ether there watching us today, so hello to my friends in New York. A brand new preservation facility in Long Island City, which I'm dying to see since I was there when the planning for that happened. And then I moved on to the National Archives, where I've had the fortune to work with Doris Hamburg and taken my education to a whole new level. Stunning facility in College Park, a smaller facility at A1 down the street, and just on Saturday we launched, dedicated the new facility in St. Louis, our civilian and military records building, which has the most gorgeous preservation conservation laboratory in it, and there's some folks in St. Louis watching. Hello. So that's kind of where I'm coming from in terms of preservation, and I don't have the luxury that I used to have of spending as much time as I can in the preservation labs to see what's going on, just watching over people's shoulders, but I'm very proud of what we're doing. So let me tell you a little bit about who we are in the National Archives, since a lot of people don't quite understand who we are. I don't have to tell this crowd, we are not the Library of Congress, and we are not the Smithsonian, which is the most frequent question I get. We are the nation's record keeper. We're responsible for all the records of the government. And that means the 275 federal agencies and the White House. We provide courtesy storage for Congress. Hello, Karen. We don't own those records, but we provide the storage and servicing for those records. So that means we have a collection of, you heard figures tossed around here. That's nothing. We have 10 billion pages of textual documents, about 40 million photographs, miles and miles of film and video, about 7 million charts, drawings, and maps, including, Stephanie, we have all the wonderful lighthouse drawings. So I have sitting on my desk, as a matter of fact, reproduction of the Hatteras lighthouse, which is just absolutely gorgeous because they're watercolors of the lighthouses. The fastest growing collection now is, of course, electronic records. My work is governed by two sets of laws, the Federal Records Act and the Presidential Records Act, very different kinds of guidelines. In 1996, the Presidential Records Act was amended to recognize electronic records, so we have been collecting, since the Reagan administration, we've been collecting electronic records on the presidential side. Every federal agency is creating records electronically now, although the Federal Records Act has not been amended yet to recognize electronic communication in the year 2011. We're working on that. So the guidance still is print and save, if you can believe it, but we're working hard, which I'll talk about in a minute, about helping to solve that problem. So that all translates into a collection which is housed in 44 facilities around the country, from Anchorage, Alaska to Atlanta, Georgia, federal records, regional federal records centers, College Park, Washington, D.C., St. Louis, as I just mentioned, and 13 presidential libraries. So 600,000 artifacts in the presidential libraries, all the gifts to the administrations, starting with Herbert Hoover, up through where we will dedicate the George W. Bush Library in April 2013, the latest. So it's an extraordinary collection. I was talking to Richard earlier about knowing exactly how many things you do have, and I often scare the staff by suggesting that we do an inventory. How do we know we have 12 billion pages, for instance? So in her invitation to participate this morning, Diane provided a series of theme questions, any one of which could have resulted in a semester's work, but I've decided to focus on three particular areas of interest and concern to me in my work here in Washington. My greatest challenges are what keeps me up at night, external collaboration opportunities, and kind of a sense of the future from where I sit. So the greatest challenges, our mission of collecting, protecting, and providing access has not changed since we were founded almost 80 years ago. But the 21st century has made preserving key government documents and making them open and accessible presents more complex and, yes, ever more difficult issues for us. Electronic records are the fastest growing part of our holdings, as I said. Let me give you just one illustration of that growth. On the presidential side, as I said, we began collecting electronic records during the Reagan administration. So we have 8 million records from that White House. We have 20 million records from the Clinton White House, and we have 260 million records from the George W. Bush White House. 210 of those are email messages. And the president loves to say, he said, so as recently as 2 weeks ago when we did the chopping off ceremony at the Bush Library, and not one of those is his. This number easily exceeds all electronic records held by all the other presidential libraries combined. Not only that, if you printed out all those emails, they would total about 620 million pages, which is more than the entire collections of the presidential libraries combined. As extensive as they are, the Bush emails are, to say the least, just the tip of the electronic iceberg. As of the end of September, we held over 124 terabytes of records from Congress, federal agencies, and the White House. And we just received 331 terabytes of electronic records from the 2010 census. Keep in mind that as recently as 1989, the total number of electronic records we were responsible for maintaining was just 14,000. Moreover, as every modern librarian and archivist knows well, the tremendous growth in the volume of electronic records is just part of this century's preservation challenge. Another pressing issue is the changing formats of digital media. When the archives began receiving electronic data files in 1970, they were primarily simple flat database and ASCII records created by early computers commonly used by some federal agencies. In the decades that followed, electronic data was created in a bewildering array of formats, each one wiping out the one that came before. We're left with the task of managing and providing access to EPSIDIC, WordPerfect, Fox Pro, Netscape Navigator, and MS-DOS. Every collecting institution is meeting the digital challenge in its own way. At the National Archives, we've launched a major initiative, the Electronic Records Archive, or ERA, to manage these huge, multifaceted electronic holdings so that they're useful and available to customers. The goal of ERA is to preserve electronic records and make them accessible while allowing federal agencies to conduct records management transactions with NARA electronically. And in fact, I am now approving record schedules and disposition schedules electronically for the first time. We received the first functional part of the ERA system for federal records in 2008. It included the basic electronic record storage system at a secure off-site location, connections to NARA facilities, and the records management workflow for scheduling and accessioning. We then added a specialized component of ERA for presidential records, followed by a simple system to meet the needs of congressional records. This year, we added a component of ERA designed for the restricted records of the 2010 census and another component of ERA for national security classified records. Less than a month ago, NARA concluded the initial development phase of ERA and selected IBM to provide operations and maintenance. Integral to the ERA is the transformation framework that was launched last month. This feature identifies attachment formats at ingests and routes them to the appropriate plugin to translate the file into digits which can be migrated over time. We're working with several international collaboratives to develop these plugins and are focused on the most at-risk formats first. For example, we have lots of NASA records in EPSIDIC. EPSIDIC is a program that was developed for use on IBM mainframes, and I don't think anyone uses it anymore. And they've created the translation package for our EPSIDIC files. As we enter the operations and management phase, ERA is now storing those 124 terabytes of records from Congress, the federal agencies, and the White House I mentioned earlier. Moreover, working with the Office of Management and Budget, we've embarked on an ambitious plan to have every federal agency adopt ERA for scheduling and accessioning records in all formats by the end of 2012. At that time, all federal agencies will be required to use ERA to schedule and transfer to the National Archives all permanent electronic records. ERA is also enabling a new era of government openness. Late last year, we launched Online Public Access, or OPA. OPA provides a public portal for access to our digitized ERA records, as well as information about records in all formats. So let me say a few words about external collaborative opportunities. As optimistic as we are about ERA as a solution to some of NARA's most pressing and unique preservation challenges, we don't pretend it's the cure-all. Like every archive, museum, library, and collecting institution, we continue to face a range of difficult 21st century preservation and access issues and quandaries. At the top of the list of the preservation challenges we all face is the money crunch, and you've heard that common theme, I think, this morning. On the one hand, our costs are going up. In the information age, most public collecting institutions have seen the size of all of our holdings, digital, paper, plastic, and other, grow steadily, and almost all of us will be seeking the additional resources needed to handle this increase. At the same time, energy costs are steadily rising, making it more expensive to preserve the records we already have that require climate-controlled storage. IT systems need to maintain and provide access to electronic records, have a critical climate control requirements as well. That means we have to find more funding even if our holdings weren't growing. Changes in global weather patterns could require new spending, too, to keep the collection safe from changes in sea level and the water table. While costs are rising, archives, libraries, and museums have to operate in an era when political leaders are looking for ways to end soaring government deficits. Everyone in Washington and state capitals is a budget hawk now. If there's not a bullseye on your institution's budget yet, there soon will be. So how can we cope with this common challenge to preservation and openness? In the near term, all of us may be forced to do more with less. In the decade ahead, I believe every collecting institution will have to make some very hard decisions about priorities in preservation and access. In the longer term, I believe we can expand preservation and provide more access, but only if we take cooperation between our institutions to a new level. In particular, I believe we have work we have to work together in two areas. We have to share our strengths, and we have to work more closely together to make our voices heard. In an era of budget pressure, each of us in our institutions doesn't have to do everything. At a time of weakened funding, we can do more to share the special knowledge, expertise, and experience among ourselves to make each organization's resources go further. In particular, we should work more closely together to start preservation actions at the earliest point in a record's life cycle, and then continue to apply preservation principles throughout the life cycle of the records. Preventing damage is much more cost-effective than repairing it. In particular, I'd like to see more exchanges of personnel among our institutions for staff development. We would all benefit by more interaction in research, more cooperation in building public-private partnerships. At NARA, for example, we've strengthened our digitization capabilities by building partnerships with EMC.com at the JFK Library, Ancestry, Google, and Fold3, which used to be known as Footnote. We could certainly share contacts made and lessons learned with this audience. We've also made a strong commitment to research on preservation, working with NIST and other agencies. The development of the encasements that house and preserve the Charters of Freedom on view in our rotunda has benefited from a number of institutions. Our host today, the Library of Congress, uses one of those encasement housings for the Walsemuller map, and we're currently back to work with NIST on the re-encasement of David Rubenstein's copy of the Magna Carta, which is on loan to the National Archives. And we'd like to work with other institutions on research in support of our common preservation efforts. In addition, we have contributed to the development of standards that can help every organization's efforts to preserve paper, photographic materials, and other formats. There's also a wealth of knowledge and experience in our 90-person preservation staff, which can be shared through new cooperative programs. Finally, we have a strong commitment to education and training in preservation. Our preservation programs already provide internships and training for other federal agencies and organizations, and many of you here have attended one of our annual preservation conferences. Again, by working together, we can see these programs expand and evolve to strengthen everyone's preservation capabilities. In addition to sharing our strengths, we need to cooperate more closely to make our voices heard. Most of you here today work in Washington, so you know all too well that the agencies that receive the most are usually organizations that can rally a constituency. Unfortunately, the community of people dedicated to preserving documents and safeguarding our history and culture is pretty small and widely dispersed. We can do more in working together to make the case. I believe our only chance to make the case for preservation to Congress and the executive branch is by working together. And I do believe one way we can do that is by telling the stories of how we have been able to save our cultural history. Let me give you some of the examples of some of the rescue work at the National Archives. So, NASA Space Shuttle video. This video was recorded on 3/4-inch U-matic and high 8 videotape. It's footage of the early years of space shuttle programs and contains launch, scientific, and day-to-day living aboard the many different shuttles used during the duration of the shuttle program. The format was developed in 1970 by Sony, JVC, and the format became the most successful video format of all time, replacing 16mm film for moving image gathering in the field and in the news services. The early 1990s saw the decline in the use of this format, replaced by newer and higher quality recorders. Due to the age and condition of the tapes, work to prepare these tapes for safe playback at times was painstaking. The tapes were inspected, repaired, cleaned, and depending upon the formulation, baked to remedy stick shed syndrome, which is a condition created by the deterioration of the binders in a magnetic tape. Supreme Court recordings. For many years, the Supreme Court recorded their yearly sessions on 1/4-inch analog open reel tape. This tape, for all intents and purposes, was fairly robust, stable, and a cost-effective recording medium. Also, the choices were limited as to what formats were available to record professionally. At the end of a year-long court session, NARA would receive many boxes of 1/4-inch tape reels. These tapes were then re-recorded years later to new polyester 1/4-inch tape for preservation purposes. And with the decline in the tape manufacturing business and the headaches of trying to maintain the court's recording machines, the court decided on moving from analog tape to digital files. The court installed a recorder capable of recording the sessions into flash media drives on MP3 format. This became the master recording. So in lieu of receiving boxes of 10-inch analog reels, NARA now receives a tiny box full of flash media cards containing the year's proceedings. To deal with this change in technology and knowing that the flash media cards, while easy to use and able to capture a decent audio signal, are in no way as robust and stable as the quarter-inch tapes and need intervention as soon as possible. The lab receives these recordings yearly and takes necessary steps in assuring their preservation, including decoding the MP3, resaving the file as a PCM broadcast wave file, naming the newly created files, and storing the files on a NAS data server and LTO3 tape. I hope that means something to someone besides Doris. So one of my favorite, as I've been visiting the 44 facilities, I got a chance to see some of this, this work in progress and also see the results of some of it. And one of my favorites is wire recordings that were taken during the 40s at Alcatraz. We have all the records of Alcatraz in San Bruno, California. And listening to one of these interrogations, this poor inmate was being chastised for having taken croutons out of the mess hall in Alcatraz. And the interrogator is challenging him, you know, what are you making soup in your cell? What are you doing with threatening to be thrown into solitary confinement for taking croutons? And this was all saved from a wire recording in San Bruno. The very fact that they were serving croutons in Alcatraz just cracks me up. So let me conclude with the vision thing. Although our individual missions and nature of our collections may differ, every archive, library, and museum strives to find the right balance between the demands of the present and the needs of our future customers and constituents for information and access. The combination of the digital revolution with the historic pressures on budgets makes finding that balance more difficult than ever at a time when the stakes are higher than ever. As we struggle to find the funding we need now, let's also keep devoting resources to those aspects of preservation that will secure the future. We must invest in research and training in preservation. And while the return on investment is not always immediately apparent, the long-term results are significant and very cost-effective. As we all struggle to do more work with less resources, we need to balance our priorities. We can't neglect basic research that will help us find new ways to preserve records in the future. In this area in particular, we need to cooperate and share information so that there is no duplication of effort among institutions. Further research will help us hone our use of resources with greater information on most critical issues. And given the economic outlook, repositories will need to find ways to do more with less, to expend resources wisely, and to establish, then stick to difficult priorities. In the area of preservation research, it will be necessary to balance specifications for environmental conditions against the fiscal resources and infrastructure needed to accomplish them. This will require testing existing assumptions and specifications to build greater understanding of how specific conditions, temperature, relative humidity, and air quality truly affect longevity of records. Educational efforts on all fronts must continue to assure that repository staff have the knowledge and tools they need to assess the preservation needs of records and apply appropriate preservation strategies. This is the light of evolving standards, methodologies, and research in material science. The unique role of archival repositories in society in terms of making information available that relates to the rights of citizens and the workings of government need to be clear to the public at large, educators, and funding sources. So, if the past teaches us anything, it is that challenges persist. A century ago, archivists and historians were crying out for the establishment of a national archives, for we were losing our national memory. 25 years ago, we were in danger of losing it again. According to the report of the Committee on the Records of Government, a bipartisan federal committee working with scholars, the United States is in danger of losing its memory. The federal government and state and local governments have huge quantities of paper records at risk. Historically valuable electronic records compound this problem. So says the committee report issued in 1985, well before the challenges posed by digital media. Today, our national memory is not at risk, but our ability to preserve the records that make up our national memory and our cultural heritage is certainly under tremendous stress. There are no simple solutions, but I do think developing new modes of cooperation offer us the best foot forward. A quote attributed to Benjamin Franklin declares, "We must indeed all hang together, or assuredly we shall all hang separately." We are not in those dire straits, but hanging together will definitely help us create and navigate successfully the 21st century preservation roadmap. Thank you.
Okay, hello. My name is Mary Uy, and I am with the Preservation Directorate here at the Library of Congress. We welcome you back to Future Directions 3, Transitioning to a Digital Future. I hope that everyone had a nice lunch break. And we are going to recommence this afternoon with a discussion session by our grant funders panel. Joining us today are Eryl Wentworth, Chuck Thomas, and Howard Wactlar. Eryl Wentworth is the Executive Director of AIC, the American Institute for Conservation of Historic and Artistic Works, and the foundation of AIC. She came to AIC and FAIC in 2004, following 20 years of working in museums. Most recently, she served as director of the Octagon Museum of the American Architectural Foundation here in Washington. Throughout her career, Eryl has supported the care of collections by working with conservators to plan, secure grant funding for, and implement major preservation and conservation projects. She has served as a panelist for challenge grants and preservation and access grants from the National Endowment for the Humanities, and for conservation support grants from the Institute of Museum and Library Services. She has also served on the boards of both local and national nonprofit organizations. Eryl has a master's degree in anthropology and museum training and a background in conservation. Chuck Thomas is the Acting Associate Deputy Director for Library Services for the Institute of Museum and Library Services, or IMLS. IMLS is the primary source of federal support for the 123,000 libraries and 17,500 museums in the U.S. Since coming to IMLS in 2008, Chuck has worked as a senior program officer with the agency's 2 largest competitive grant programs, including the National Leadership Grants. Previously, he worked as an archivist and as a digital librarian for more than 12 years in multiple large university libraries, managing collaborative digitization projects, building technology infrastructure to support scholars and students, as well as focusing on general technology administration. He currently is working on a PhD in information science and is writing his dissertation on evaluating scholarly communication systems. And I'm sorry, I went out of order. Actually, Chuck is on the far right. And Howard Wactlar, who's in the middle, is the Division Director for Information and Intelligence Systems in the Computer and Information Science and Engineering Directorate of the National Science Foundation. He is on leave as Vice Provost for Research Computing, as Associate Dean in the School of Computer Science, and as Alumni Research Professor of Computer Science at Carnegie Mellon University. Among his many research initiatives, Howard was the primary architect and project director of the Infomedia Digital Video Library, one of the original National Science Foundation Digital Library Initiative projects. He served as director of the joint Carnegie Mellon IBM Information Technology Center, which pioneered ubiquitous campus computing. Howard holds basic patents for processes related to automated video library creation and video search and summarization. Through joint initiatives with multiple foreign partners, he has been active in establishing video information research programs in the US, Europe, and China. He graduated in physics from the University of Maryland and from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. And I had asked them earlier if Eryl would be happy to lead off, and she graciously agreed. So I hand it now over to Eryl. Thank you.
Thank you, Mary. Good afternoon, everyone. You've had a wonderful morning of incredible speakers. I am honored to be here this afternoon representing the Foundation of the American Institute for Conservation. And I just am still trying to digest all the things that were talked about this morning. It was just full of, actually, a lot of hope. I think, too, that there are so many incredible minds and experts who are thinking about these problems so carefully and wanting and anxious to work together to begin to solve some of the challenges, because these are tremendously huge challenges that we're talking about in preservation, both with legacy collections and digital collections. And I think the trick will be not to be overwhelmed by it, but to be able to take it in manageable chunks that we can tackle effectively. And I think that speaks to some of the things that Deanna was saying this morning about how we need to prioritize our activities. And I thought I would, and I just want to, before I go into that, I just want to say too that I feel that we are so blessed as a nation to have these incredible national resources, these invaluable federal agencies. And I find it so remarkable that it is thanks to our early leaders of this nation, and that they had the foresight to think about this, that President John Adams, created the Library of Congress in 1800. I just still find that absolutely remarkable, and that these other following leaders in Congress and presidents saw the importance of building these remarkable collections, and now we have to convince them to continue to help us save them and make sure that they're accessible for the future. So I think what I'll just start in my remarks, and then we'll develop more of a conversation as we go through, but I think I'd like to begin by thinking a little bit about what is it that the foundation of the American Institution, what did I say? The Foundation of the American Institute for Conservation. What is it that we can do? We're a young organization. We're a very small organization. I hate to say we have only 9 staff, but what we do have are a lot of resources. We have a tremendous AIC membership of experts, and many of whom are working in these federal agencies. So we have this incredible network of people who are already talking together through AIC and through their specialty areas. And that's a tremendous resource right there. And I think the other thing that FAIC brings to the table is a nimbleness, to be able to respond to needs that come to our attention, to be able to embark on new initiatives and to develop new partnerships. So I hope that ability to move relatively easily will help in the upcoming discussions, because I do think that these future directions symposiums are so incredibly valuable, but they need to be the launching point for these more in-depth discussions about what priorities and what shared challenges can be addressed. So I think just briefly, one of the things that FAIC excels at is professional development. And I think that we should be looking at it, not just professional development for conservators, but also looking beyond. There's a huge resource in the volunteers at these federal agencies. And I suspect that one of the reasons that environmental conservation is supported by so many Americans is in part due to the almost 1.5 million volunteers in the National Park Service, which I find is a remarkable resource, but these are people who are passionate about it and spread the word to family and friends. So why can't we harness that same kind of passion for preservation of our national heritage? So I think that if we are looking at training and education, that we can look to those volunteers in these agencies and beyond that, through all our collecting organizations. And FAIC certainly is in a position to be a lead applicant in grant proposals, both through federal granting agencies and private foundations, to develop, if there are priorities created through the agencies, how can we, what are the programs that we can begin to work on and develop the training programs? There's so many areas that were touched on in the morning session that were topics that could be addressed, not only the preservation of legacy collections, born digital collections, but also emergency preparedness and emergency response. And AIC does have a trained group of collection emergency responders, and these were funded through 2 grants by the Institute of Museum and Library Services, and we thank them so much that this team has been able to respond to emergencies both in the United States and, as Richard mentioned this morning, in Haiti, which was an honor to help that country's art history, preserve its art. But also we can do a lot, and are doing a lot, through grants to do training in that. We've worked with the American Association of Museums to develop webinars in emergency response areas for in emergency preparedness. We're in a current grant that we have now, again with IMLS. We'll be working with the National Parks, or excuse me, with the National Trust for Historic Preservation to train the staffs and volunteers in historic museums. And I could go on and on to talk about all the wonderful partnerships we've had with these agencies and with granting agencies too in terms of training, but I won't go into all of that now. One other point I'd like to make before I turn this over to my colleagues is that Deanna mentioned the issue of decision-making, which is a huge piece of the puzzle, and the lack of training in administration in these areas. And I do think one thing that I am very encouraged about related to that is the emerging leaders in conservation, who are an amazing group of people who think about their role in conservation and preservation differently, I think, than in the earlier generation. And I think that they're gaining those skills and certainly have the energy to do some of the more advocacy level work and administrative level work to help us solve some of these problems. So I do see that as an important piece. One other thing I'm going to mention is that we have had sort of a grassroots effort coming forward from a whole group of our members to create a new division within AIC, and that is to create a preventive conservation or a collection care network. And I think that's another piece of the puzzle of drawing in more people who are collection care specialists to work with conservators and curators and administrators to again, solve these problems, to advocate for the work that needs to be done. So, and I will just say that the board will be reviewing that proposal in the November board meeting, and I think there's a great deal of excitement about it. I'd also like to see how that plays into the heritage science movement that's happening now, and how FAIC and AIC can incorporate that too within the collection care area to make us stronger partners with others to help us solve these huge issues and challenges that we're facing. Thank you.
Thank you, Eryl. So, first, thank you for inviting me. It's been a wonderful experience so far. I've learned an awful lot, and that's always a sign of a good day when you can walk away learning something new. Now, we heard a lot this morning about the many challenges we have, But I also want to recognize that we heard about a lot of accomplishments as well. I think the job that's been done to date is phenomenal. And rather than thinking them as just challenges, we've heard about a lot of opportunities today as well, ways in which we can possibly move forward. And I hope that in this next hour or so we'll explore some of those by looking at them as opportunities and seeing what progress we may be able to make. Now, the role of the National Science Foundation in all of this is really one of bringing to bear a large community of scientists focused on information technology, in particular materials technology, people who are interested in data, in information, in knowledge, and the progression between those three. So there's a large base of people who have very strong interests in seeing that we preserve the history of the information and see how it was turned into knowledge and be able to continue to convey the knowledge that exists in the archives that we have. Now, in listening to the various discussions this morning, I kind of saw the world into the world of what to preserve in two pieces. One is, of course, preserving the information. What is the data and information content in what we are trying to continue to preserve? And we know we have lots of digital techniques for capturing that and indexing it, retrieving it, and visualizing it. So we're very well ensconced in that part of it. But I think the biggest opportunity and challenge that we have is preserving the experience of viewing, of sharing that data. We need to determine ways of recreating that walk through a part of a national park. I was thinking, as I was hearing some of the speakers talk about images, until I was an adult, I always thought that the Mona Lisa was a painting about 2 feet wide and 3 feet high, and you just don't get a sense of it until you can recreate that experience for others of what its size is, what its detail is like, and the representations become extremely important to understanding what the actual artifact was, and so I think the most important challenge and opportunity that we have is in recreating the experience of sharing all of those artifacts as we saw them. And we should focus on how to use technology to enable us to do that.
Okay. Thank you, Howard. So there were a few things that struck me this morning listening to the conversation. Like Eryl and Howard, I greatly appreciate the invitation and the opportunity to speak to folks here and out there in internet land. A few things that I think were important for us to hear again today were that reminder about the cyclical nature of the work that we do. There is this aspect of having to revisit the programs and the specific conservation and preservation activities sometimes that we've performed, that once it's done, it's not always done, that you have to come back to it. So I took that to heart as just a key walkaway point that I might think about a little more today. Selection, of course, was presented, I think, in an entirely different scale and context today. Some of the numbers we heard today, Richard Kurin talking about 137 million items, and David Ferriero talking about 10 billion pages of textual, probably mainly content. And then billion. That's what I meant to say if I did not say billion. Yes, 10 billion. Thinking about that, though, in the larger national context, beyond just a few specific national collections, that the Heritage Health Index that was completed just a couple of years ago, surveying what's at risk in archives, museums, and libraries around the country, identified just on a high-level pass about 14, no, that's not right. Excuse me, let me tap my iPad here to refresh my memory on that one. There we go. 4.8, I don't want to exaggerate, 4.8 billion artifacts, and the number of pages of content sitting in designated repositories. So organizations that have agreed to take on some stewardship of materials is in the hundreds of billions of pages of actual books and periodicals, reports, manuscripts, collections of all sorts. So it's an extremely large number. And from my perspective, looking at the 123,500 public libraries in the country, 17,500 museums, and then some additional number of archives that range from everything like a local history room in a public library to a local historical society to various other kinds of repositories for materials. It is extremely difficult to think how one person or one organization could coordinate that all. So putting on my IMLS hat, looking at it from a funder's perspective, I think it's more important than ever when we're thinking about those numbers and the exponential growth of digital information and the increasing importance of selection there, which I'd like to come back to in just a moment, that we need to draw upon crowdsourced or group-sourced efforts from the national community to help us make those decisions. Richard Kurin earlier said that a collection is a community. I think that curation and selection of collections is a community effort as well. One of the changes that the Institute of Museum and Library Services is making in some of its larger grant programs just over the past year or two is to debut a new type of planning grants that we're renaming in this coming grant cycle as National Forum Grants that hopefully clearly communicates that we want nationally representative groups of experts in different domains to come together and look at a problem, and dealing with threats to particular collections or types of information shared across multiple repositories is certainly one of those kinds of problems. And then we require that those sorts of grantees make expert recommendations for how, as a community, the problem should be addressed. Those kinds of feedback mechanisms are enormously helpful to us as a funding agency to judge the validity and the importance of various problems that we see identified every year in the grant proposals that come to us. So I hope that that will be a promising new way to garner extra community feedback. On that issue of selection for digital materials in particular, about a year ago I went to the IPRES, or International Digital Preservation Meeting, and the focus of that year's conference is digital preservation green, or can it be green, or environmentally sustainable? And it was a very interesting topic because I've worked as an archivist and a digital library guy for many years, and I always ran into people saying storage is cheap, let's just scan everything, rather than selecting the pieces of collections, or whether it's a topical collection or the larger sense of a collection of holdings within an organization. Let's just scan as much as we can, systematically work our way through the shelves. And while it is true that storage is cheap, I don't think that long-term monitoring or the other tasks that go along with true preservation is cheap by any means. And one of the points that came up in the IPRES conference presentations was that we're starting to hit some of the technical limits of retrieval once you start putting that much information into server farms. And so people from Google's IT division and other European agencies that are holding large amounts of data, we're talking about the technical challenges of designing systems that can pull information back. After a certain point, it becomes overly cumbersome to get too much information back. So I think that selection is still very important. And I'm not telling you anything you couldn't already guess, but I'm glad that there is some hard data and some anecdotes from people who are managing these large data storage environments to give us other details of what that looks like. The other thing that really was reinforced multiple times for me in the conversations this morning was the importance of local and national perspectives on this. I appreciate that our focus coming into it this morning was talking about national organizations. One of the questions that seems to come up in a number of proposals and subsequent panel discussions for the peer reviewers who look at proposals coming into IMLS related to preservation is whether or not the preservation models that are established by larger organizations work well when you bring them down to small and medium-sized organizations for a number of different reasons, ranging from resources that are available to the fact that sometimes smaller organizations can choose from a greater variety of options as to how they could accomplish a preservation mission. So I think that one of the things that is important for our nation to continue to look at and to put resources into is taking the time to test different options and different models that may be generated by well-resourced and very reputable organizations, and go to the trouble to make sure that they work at other sizes and contexts, and to record any gaps that we might note. And so those are some of the kinds of preservation projects that we've also been funding over the past couple of years. For those of you who aren't very familiar with IMLS, it's probably worth noting that a significant piece of the grants that we make each year in programs like the National Leadership Grants Program are focusing on preservation, and still lots of key questions that need to be answered. For example, several years ago, the project just wrapped up. The University of Rochester conducted an investigation of more environmentally friendly storage environments, because the amount of electricity and money that it takes to maintain a stable temperature and humidity in buildings that don't all have the same structural materials and modern HVAC systems and everything else, it can be quite a challenge for a library or a museum or an archive to just maintain some core basic standards. So we've funded work that looked at and is trying to measure whether it's still feasible to maintain an acceptable storage environment by cycling on and off the humidity and temperature controls. I have not had a chance to review the findings from that. The report just came in very recently, but I'm looking forward to seeing what those results were. We have also funded other research projects that have, for example, deployed sensors all across large organizational storage environments, monitoring not just temperature and humidity, but looking at different types of light that materials are exposed to, and sensors that are delicate enough to know when a staffer might have had a lunch with garlic, measuring changes in the quality of the air inside the archive, and other patterns and microenvironments that can pop up in a large storage facility, and looking at how much it costs to deploy that kind of active monitoring of a collection to have an extremely detailed report on what's going on in your preservation environment. In addition to those kinds of research projects, there are other questions for new emerging types of digital information that we still don't have recommendations for good practice or even a definition of what should be captured for preservation. A couple of examples would be video games and other types of interactive environments. Depending on the type of interactive environment that you're talking about, it could be different key pieces of information that might need to be recorded in addition to just the computer program about what level of detail you're going to capture information. Howard and I were talking at lunch about the experience that he mentioned. It's also important in some regards to capture what one would have experienced when you were going through an instructional video game or some other type of learning environment that's machine-based. We have funded in the past projects to specify what needs to be preserved in CAD drawings, like Stephanie was talking about earlier today. But what you typically see coming out of those sorts of investments with grant money are recommendations for best practice, which is great because that allows a wider audience to take a look and make sure that everything that the original investigators identified rings true for them and for their context, and to continue discussions from that point forward. So those are the kinds of things that we've been investing in lately in the preservation realm. I think that I hit most of the themes that I saw this morning, so I'll just open it back up to everyone else.
Okay. Shall we just go around and comment? So first one point of difference. I mean, I do believe we should record everything. I don't think we are at a point of having the wisdom and the rational arguments at this point as to decide what we should and shouldn't preserve as long as the cost of digitization continues to go down at the rate that it has. I mean, think about the fact that disk storage now is, what, 3.5 cents a megabyte, something like that. A gigabyte, excuse me. That the ratio of over the last 20 years has been something like a factor of 1 million in cost reduction, and we're not at a point yet where fundamental physics tells us we can't go any further. So I think we should continue to believe that there's great progress still to be made in storage, and it's too early for us to make decisions that we don't have to. So let's defer those decisions about storage, about what we must get rid of, what as a society it's okay to forget. Let's hold off on that decision for as long as we can. Sustain that we have, and then if and when we need to face those decisions, we'll have more data to make those decisions. So I'm a full supporter of laying that issue to rest. Unfortunately, the decisions about what to keep and what not to keep are guided by financial decisions, resource decisions. But certainly in terms of digitization, we should continue to hold ground for as long as we can in terms of trying to decide what the differences are. Again, the issue is the wisdom we have now may not be what we need later. I mean, we may find that there's a lot that's buried in the history and in the collection of what we have at this point, where we may not think something is important, or we may not think the difference between two things is big enough, but sometime down the line we will see that there is a significance in that. So let's defer that decision as long as we can. Now that brings to mind the other issue, though, which is if we're going to record everything or as much as we humanly can digitally, how do we deal with the problem that since the technology is changing so rapidly, that we have to keep reformatting things for the new technology? I think that's a major issue that we have to face, because the human cost of reformatting everything can be quite large. So we have to look to other mechanisms beyond our own ability. And one thing that we talked about earlier was that there are new technologies in terms of vast service functions that are out there, like cloud computing. Now what cloud computing is it really doesn't exist in the clouds. It really is just a highly distributed environment that's seemingly endless. Okay, now it's endless because the commercial world has not found the barriers to making it continuously larger at this point. And when our data exists in that cloud, assuming it's adequately protected and secure and retrievable, it's that cloud that will, and the managers and owners and developers of that cloud of service that will continue to evolve and find the most efficient way of reformatting and storing that data. It's the entrepreneurial environment that drives them to find the lowest cost. So we don't have to become the ones to continuously make that decision every few years about how to upgrade. I mean, let the commercial world, in a sense, upgrade it for us based on the constraints that they have, because the market pressures will really force them to find the cheapest way. So let's take advantage of those kind of pressures whenever we can, because they ultimately, when we talk about capabilities, well, I was mentioning trying to recreate the experience. Well, what makes that more possible now than ever before is the wonderful commercial marketplace of the people who manufacture electronic games. Okay, they have brought forth lots of technology to create very innovative experiences for young and old, and we can certainly recreate the experience of a walk through a museum. So again, it's that commercial marketplace that we need to leverage, we need to take advantage of in order to protect our own interests. So again, keep those in mind. I don't think we should constrain ourselves until we really have to, and I think we should take advantage of what the rest of the intellectual and commercial community is developing that we can use.
Thank you. Yes. These remarks have made me go back to some of the comments that were made earlier about the importance of these federal agencies to continue to develop policy, to set the guidelines, to begin to see how we can make these decisions, to help guide best practices documents to be developed. And I think that speaks to sort of the ripple down effect. Is that the right word? The dribble down effect, whatever it is. But going from these major institutions with their resources and challenges, but then how does this play out across the country in smaller repositories and the decisions that they need to make, because they are also faced on smaller scales with these same decisions of storage and environmental issues and the lack of ability to do research or to even sometimes understand what the research is telling them. So how can we help with that? And one thing I did want to mention is an amazing program that's been going on for a number of years, begun with funding with the Institute for Museum and Library Services, but the Connecting to Collections program is one example of something like that. And the nice thing about it is that unlike some of the congressionally funded programs that should have been funded for 20 years but didn't have that funding, this program is going forward despite changes in funding, I think, as far as we know, and leadership. And I think that's pretty remarkable that not only has Connecting to Collections taken preservation issues across the countries to help people in rural areas or who don't have as many resources to be able to talk to conservators, to be able to understand what the bigger issues are. I think that's huge to do that. And now the latest iteration of this program is the C2C Online program that is being funded through IMLS and managed through Heritage Preservation. And that is a tremendous resource that I know as we're building our collection care network, that will be a resource that we will be partnering with and helping to grow with the resources that are being developed. So I do love the concept of working from the big picture federal agencies with their billions of collections, but how that connects with these small collecting areas and the challenges that these staff members are facing. I'd also like to circle back just for a moment to the importance of research. Chuck mentioned some of the storage issues and environmental issues, and there's such a big push now by many of the museums to broaden the environmental guidelines. And I think one of the things that many conservators are feeling is we don't have the data. We don't have that research to really know what issues we're facing. We can't just sort of say, oh, well, 60 to 80 relative humidity, fine, percentage relative humidity, without understanding what that means for different types of collections, particularly very sensitive organic materials, for instance. So the importance of research to help guide the decision-making process is absolutely critical as we move forward. Also, I'd like to mention too, speaking of resources like the C2C Online, 2 years ago, FAIC assumed responsibility for conservation online. I think many of you might know this resource. It was created by Stanford University about 25 years ago now, and they kindly gave it to us 2 years ago, and we began really by researching and doing surveys with stakeholders about what this resource meant to them, how was the information used, what are the expectations for it for the future. And I found it really fascinating that the cool resource, the archived, or the archives in a sense, or the library of information, really is a relic in itself. I mean, it is old technology, and many conservators doing research today aren't really going to use it because it is hard to navigate. It's hard to have the accessibility to the different aspects of it, though there's still tremendous resources in there in terms of the content. But otherwise, it's kind of a relic. Unlike the disk list, the conservation disk list, which even though it's still very simple technology, from what we're learning, no one really wants to see a major change to that, and it is used. It has over 10,000 subscribers from 93 countries around the world. It's a tremendous shared resource where people from anywhere can ask questions about new materials, about treatment. They can learn about conferences that are coming up, calls for papers, what's just new in the field. So it's a tremendous resource, but needs to be backed up by Conservation Online as a resource. And that is something that we're now, having done this research, and having gotten a lot of advice, and partly through the Library of Congress and the staff here who have been incredibly gracious about helping us think through what are the possibilities for this resource and what are the challenges for us. And it's exciting. We're now getting some proposals, and we'll be able to go to some funding agencies to think about how we can use this as a way to help people from anywhere in the world understand what the current information is, what current information is available to them, what is ongoing research, and have an like wikis that are being created, have an interactive component that can help people participate in these decisions, and so that there is not so much of a gap between the knowledge at places with the tremendous staffs as these federal agencies have, but even if you're in I'll just pick Oklahoma out of the blue, but if you're in a rural area in Oklahoma, what are your resources? Well, they can be pretty amazing using the technology today. So I just thought I'd bring in those sort of three sort of different areas as a comment.
Eryl, I think that's a good point. It's worth stating a couple of times that there are still untested models that need to be examined to deal with what Howard called the human costs involved in some aspects of preservation, and that we don't know how well some of these alternate approaches might work. And I think there are a lot of libraries, archives, and museums that are looking for new solutions and new suggestions, and so we are definitely interested in reviewing and looking at suggestions for new ways to approach the big tasks that a staff of even the Library of Congress's size has challenges. I hope that I'm not making any wrong assumptions here. It's still a challenge for this organization with the number of employees you have to effectively administer a preservation program, right? Okay. The shared management issues, though, do become a little more complicated down at the local level because, you know, when we talk in a national context or in universities or in a regional context, larger associations and better resourced organizations might be able to contribute some of the effort that goes into building a piece of a shared infrastructure and devoting resources to it. When you get down to the very local level, it's much more challenging for them to have any spare capacity or resources. But we still believe, I believe collectively, that collaboration increases your chances of success with sustaining cultural heritage collections. I liked what Diane said earlier, that it's not just cultural heritage assets that are increasing, but business assets, but collectively they're all increasing in value as time goes by, and I wonder at what point one switches over to the other. Having worked in some Southern history archives in the past, and just what was the day-to-day byproduct of a business's operation becomes very useful information for historical and cultural research later on. It's always good to keep those sorts of long-term values in mind. One other thing that I didn't highlight earlier as a theme from earlier today, but it was mentioned at least a couple of times as a need, is our workforce issues. And I think that we really should take advantage of the time that we have right now to just mention the need for qualified preservation staff, conservators, and preservation administrators around the country. There are very few channels or training opportunities to produce an adequate supply to meet the demand, at least based on the information that I have currently. IMLS does fund such initiatives as being able to sponsor a few fellowships every year to place people who've had some preservation graduate level training to go and work in a large preservation lab or organization, and to shadow and interact and work with the leaders of the organization so that they get that higher level perspective on what really goes into effectively managing a full preservation operation. We've also got some other investments that have been made in the library, archives, and museum workforce over the past decade or a few more years than that. For example, the Laura Bush 21st Century Librarian Program has trained several thousand new librarians since 2003 and over 200 people with PhDs, and I would not say that they are all preservation specialists, but there has been a recurring emphasis in many of the scholarship and fellowship programs that has dealt with the broader topic of digital curation and digital information management, and so of which we tend to consider digital preservation as a piece of that, but it also involves more planning from the moment before or right at the moment of information creation through the end of an information asset's life cycle. So this need that was discussed earlier today to teach preservation in as many, for example, LIS or Library and Information Science graduate classes as possible. I agree with that, if you can have a program dedicated to it, that it should be a core piece of what they're learning, how to deal with digital information. And I think that the realization of what librarians and information professionals are being asked to do when they go out into the workforce these days is to do extensive consulting, not just in universities with people who are creating research data sets or electronic assets that way, but down at the public library level, communities. People in their everyday lives are generating their own digital memories and their own libraries of music and photographs and documents and everything else. And they don't have tools and expertise readily available to them, much less a place to store it that they can guarantee that they can get it back. So every person seems to be faced with having to come up with their own personal preservation strategy as well. And you know, that's down at an individual's materials, but that's what makes up the archives materials that show up later on. We did fund a demonstration project at the Denver Public Library a couple of years ago. It's still ongoing now, to build a community storage site, at least for people to, on a, I would not say a permanent basis, but on a demonstration basis, to be placing some of their own digital information into this community resource and having the option of sharing it with other people or not, to build something that looks like a hybridized archive environment, possibly. I'll use that term very loosely right now, but also with a collections access site for objects that deal with their perspectives on their community and its history or what's going on currently in the community. This whole issue of infrastructure supporting it, Howard mentioned commercial options as one of the things that we need to be aware of that are affecting the current landscape, that we should leverage what others have perhaps a financial incentive to build anyway, and see if that can serve some of the needs that we also have in the cultural heritage preservation arena.
Okay, so all of this makes me think of, well, what are the next steps? What do we really have to do next? How, and how can we do it? So from my perspective as a scientist and a division director in National Science Foundation, says, well, you have some good challenges here. You have to, but you have to translate them into some scientific and technical challenges and problems. We have to get together as a community of librarians and preservationists and reformulate our needs to be able to talk to that science community. We have to get a connection between the diverse communities. We have to, you know, at some level talk the same language, understand what the problems are, and be able to explore solutions. You can certainly ask the technology community to get you another factor of 10 in cost reduction in storage, but that's not enough, and it's only short term. But maybe we can answer the question of how to retrieve from collections that are ever increasingly massive, how to visualize the results so that it's more customized to the individual and the context that individual has in terms of their ability to understand what we deliver. But I think it really behooves us at this point to try and formulate the challenges as technical and scientific problems that others can pursue, and bring the groups together so that you know, the so-called roundtable, where we can discuss a need, and somebody else can describe a possible solution. Indeed, it's research. The research, you have to have a challenge. Some solutions won't come to fruition. Some won't prove scalable or viable or cost effective. but until the scientific community is adequately faced with a description of the need and the barriers, they're not going to address the problem. So I encourage the community to get together and try and articulate what some of the limitations are that science and technology can approach.
I just circling back to another part of the workforce issue. I do want to mention the importance too of training our future leaders. We have a whole generation who are going to be retiring in the next several years, and how do we make sure that we are bringing these emerging leaders into the field? And there's a program that the Samuel H. Kress Foundation has had for several years, and they've recently asked FAIC to manage it, and we were just thrilled to. It is the Conservation Fellowship Program, providing emerging conservation professionals the opportunity to expand their skills in paid year-long supervised internships in collecting institutions around the world. And this is such a hugely important program, and I'd urge anyone who has the ability to supervise an emerging conservator to take advantage of applying for this fellowship program. And you can find out about it on the AIC's website if you want to look into that a little bit more. I think I had two, these were kind of wrap-up kind of things that I wanted to throw out, but one recurring issue that I've been hearing ever since I've come to AIC, and it's certainly a hot topic right now, is public outreach and public education, and how do we get people to really embrace the preservation of our national heritage, of our world heritage for that matter, in the ways that they've embraced environmental conservation. And I almost think we need a game, or we need a public crowdsourcing challenge or something that will help us come up with those phrases, those catchphrases that will excite people about what conservators and preservation specialists do, and why is that important to me at home with, my family's wedding dress that's come through a few generations, or the tall clock that I inherited from my great-grandfather. How does that connect, and what are the language that we can use to make these connections, and to developing the stories that were mentioned earlier too, the compelling stories, because they are compelling stories. The story of the flag that Richard spoke about, that excites people, but it doesn't have to be just icons such as the flag. There are all sorts of ways we can get people excited. I know from member stories about conversations they've had about certain work that they've been doing, and how they can excite people, and the fact that we now have a number of the visible conservation labs growing around the country, and how that is so, it's become such an incredible resource for the museum. And how do we then use that excitement to help the leaders of the museums, help the donors, and help our national leaders understand how important that is? And I think that if we can all work together to create these storylines, we might have a bigger impact. So that was one of my messages. Should I wait till the other one? I'll toss it on and come back. Should I go? Okay. Well, I was just going to also just make a suggestion of one potential step that could be made that I would love to see happen, is to create, following these incredible symposiums, to create a joint working group or a task force of the federal agencies, of representatives from the federal agencies and others, funders, the foundation, of course, would love to be a part of it, but and actually FAIC could be the lead grant applicant to to see if the funds could be raised to begin to explore what are the shared challenges of these agencies and what are the shared priorities and how can we begin to address them and who are the people, what are the resources we need to do this. And I think just having these very focused types of meetings would be a tremendous way to start and build on the amazing, I think the amazing challenges that have been brought to us today and the amazing opportunities both. We have so many talented people in the room, and I think that's something we just need to take advantage of and see how we can collaborate. And that word comes up again and again today, and I think that is the issue that we need is how can we best collaborate? How can we learn to work together? And that's what I very much look forward to seeing in the coming year.
Something came to mind just listening to my two fellow panelists here. Howard talking about the need to, the need to present the need to scientists and researchers, yes, that you need to clearly define what the problem is. It reminded me of a study that the National Academy of Sciences is doing right now in the science, but also to a more limited extent with some cultural heritage domains. They are trying to gauge what the job market will look like for digital information management professionals over the next decade. That study was just funded a couple of months ago, and also define what the skills will be that will help one be successful in those kinds of jobs over the next decade. So I'm glad that it's catching the attention of groups like that community, that they want to get ahead of the problem and to make some informed decisions about resource allocation to meet whatever need as best as they can measure it. This other messaging theme that Eryl was talking about a few minutes ago, I know I keep going back to the local level, or the words I've been using, the very local level, just thinking about how well you can get a message across if you can tell somebody something about their particular community or something that they encounter and see every day, and the success that sometimes smaller organizations have in public engagement. It may not be a widely publicized effort, but there's something there, and anecdotally you hear a lot about that. I think it's also worth mentioning, by the way, just on one more workforce note, the anecdotal information that we get at IMLS about interest in careers in archives administration, which would be a piece of the audience that we're trying to communicate with here, continues to increase every year, that the number of people coming into LIS graduate programs wanting to work with cultural content and preservation of the cultural memory continues to grow, even as some other areas of specialization are declining, and even with the advent of the iSchools as a major movement among the graduate LIS schools, that folks want to be adequately trained, I should say, in managing collections of cultural memory.
Did we want to take questions from the audience? That's fine too.
Individual questions are fine with me.
I'm here.
I am here too.
And I will be glad to answer. If anyone has any immediate questions that they would like to share with everyone else, I'm glad to field them here. I think my co-speakers are.
Is there anyone who would like to ask a formal question?
My name is Ann Mason with National Park Service, and I was very intrigued by some of the things that Howard was saying about clearly identifying what we need so that we can reach out to the scientific community. I find that's a constant struggle in my agency to convey to the IT department that we have these things that are permanent federal records that we have to preserve forever, and to define forever to the IT department is sometimes a challenge. So if you guys have any suggestions to how do we reach out to those people?
Well, I think IT departments, like all others, have their own set of constraints and are trying to avoid yet one more problem on their doorstep. That's why I was suggesting trying to reach out to a step beyond that, to the science community that, quite frankly, we can fund to solve some of these problems. I mean, at some level, a computer scientist will look at it all as just bits and data and transactions that have to occur on that data. But then they're also capable of moving way up into understanding what the broader impact is and how the resources have to be matched to the individual in the context of the individual. So again, that's why I think there's some value in getting together as a community and looking at what you think your limitations are, and then working with the science community to better articulate what they are and seek the solutions. The individual departments, again, like so many of us, are just financially constrained in one way or another. They're not open to doing yet one more thing. So let's try and rally the science community who can get some funding to do it.
So the only other thing that comes to mind for me would be explaining the difference between preserving the original bits of data that were given to someone who you asked to make them persist for some amount of time, whether it's 2 years or forever, and doing some educational efforts to explain the use component and how that factors in that the ability to reuse materials is an important aspect of the kind of preservation or persistence that you're talking about.
We're very pleased to have Charles Henry from the Council on Library and Information Resources to do a summation of today's program. Charles is the president of the Council on Library and Information Resources. Before coming to CLEAR, Charles was a provost and university librarian at Rice University, where he was responsible for library services and programs, including the Digital Library Initiative and the Digital Media Center. He served as publisher of Rice University Press, the nation's first all-digital university press. He was chair of the advisory committee for the Information Resource Center at the International University of Bremen for many years, and is a member of the American Council of Learned Societies Commission on Cyber Infrastructure in the Humanities and Social Sciences. He is currently on the board of trustees of, I should have asked about this, of Tao University in Vietnam, serves on the advisory board of Stanford University Libraries, is also a board member of the National Institute for Technology and Liberal Education, and of the Center for Research Libraries, and a member of the scientific board of the Open Access Publishing and the European Network Project. Charles has written dozens of publications and has received numerous grants and awards, including from the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation, the Samuel H. Kress Foundation, the National Endowment for the Humanities, the National Science Foundation, and the J. Paul Getty Trust. He's received a Fulbright Senior Scholar Grant for Library Sciences in New Zealand, and more recently in China, and a Fulbright Award for the study of medieval literature in Vienna, Austria. Charles has a bachelor's degree in philosophy from Northwest Missouri State University and a PhD in comparative literature from Columbia University, among other degrees. So I think you can see why we've asked him to sum up for us. With no further ado, I give you our dear friend, Charles Henry.
Is this getting through? Clear? Can you not hear me? Oh, great. Thank you for that lovely introduction, Diane. It's always a pleasure to be here. I think this series has been profoundly important, and I think you all agree that today has been just chock-a-block with ideas and insight. It has been a full day, and we are at the end of it. And I'm going to keep my comments short and somewhat informal. As a matter of summarizing the day, I think that there's too much up there that's susceptible to summary, and I think you'll all go home and think about what we heard today, as will I. What I thought I'd do is to briefly draw your attention to 4 different programs and projects in higher education. We've heard today from the Smithsonian, we've heard from NARA and the National Park Service, we've heard from the funding agencies. Wanted to kind of pull back and look at an area a bit more diffuse, look at higher education in general, but to focus mostly on the humanities. Dealing with the preservation of the cultural record, humanists are going to get involved one way or the other. I think there's some really interesting projects, programs, and sort of new concepts that are coming out of humanistic research and teaching. And I'll just draw your attention to it, and then we can break. There's really 4 projects and programs I want to talk about. One is the relationship between preservation and scholarly interpretation. And this is an area I think we would all do well to consider, continuing to think about this more and to think about actually building symposia around this issue. Part of this comes from any of you who have had the golden opportunity to visit the Preservation Directorate in this library will come away awed. I speak for myself. I've been down there 2 or 3 times, and every time is a revelation. And it's a revelation in the sense that the wonderful advanced sophistication of the technology that's being used, the electron microscopes, the spectrometry analysis, the chemical analysis, the X-ray machines that are being used to preserve objects of cultural importance and to get a better understanding of what these objects hold, what their content is. And when you're walking through there and you see these wonderful examples of music files that look like a smudge on a page, and through certain kinds of analysis, all of a sudden you hear the song that's part of this smudge. And you look at maps and notations and images that you can't see with the naked eye, all of a sudden become revealed. Words appear in some of Jefferson's writings and Lincoln's writings that you could never see before. So we're in this era of an amazing ability to sort of see what has been invisible sometimes for centuries, and now we can see it. And the point is, that's wonderful, first of all, to reveal these hidden aspects of our cultural treasures. But then the interpretation of these cultural objects is going to be influenced by this work as well. So if a scholar has a Jefferson letter and some key words are scratched out, no one's been able to look at, and what is behind this scratch out for 200 years, all of a sudden some really interesting words pop up through this analysis. Well, that scholar is going to reinterpret. There's going to be a community of reinterpretation. And I think that's something, and that's the point, that there is a very powerful and sophisticated continuity of decision-making that preservation entails, that leads then and helps determine what the interpretation of that object is going to be. So there's a line of thinking between the preservationist, the selection of the objects, the preservationist, the curator, the scholar, the student. And it's that line of thinking, it's that lineage of intellectual activity that I think we should focus more on. Or we have an opportunity, particularly with this kind of technology, to look at the whole spectrum, if you will, of engagement with our cultural heritage that both is anchored in preservation, transcends it, and then comes back to it. Again, because as these works are preserved and interpreted, those interpretations then often can influence further kinds of preservation activity. So it's a very interesting, again, complex loop. So that's one area. The second area to draw your attention to is new forms of scholarly research in the humanities. And I'll give you a concrete example and the implications of this example, these types of examples for preservation and our understanding of preservation. Most of you know that about 2 years ago, the National Endowment for the Humanities partnered with the National Science Foundation and the Social Science and Humanities Research Center, SHRC, in Canada, and the Joint Information Steering Committee, JISC, in the UK, and came up with a program called Digging into Data. Another round is underway now. IMLS is involved with that, and I think 2 or 3 other European agencies. It's grown, which is great. The nature of this program was that humanists, this was for the humanities, humanists were to submit proposals, but it had to be collaborative proposals, and the collaborators had to be, in the most cases, were computer scientists, computer scientists, engineers, or those working in supercomputer centers and high-performance computer centers, and scholars in linguistics, in music analysis, poetry, cartography, and history, and art history. So just a gamut of humanities disciplines partnered with some very advanced computational expertise. And the first year, I think 8 projects were funded, and most of them had not only a disciplinary collaboration, interdisciplinary aspect to them, but they also had an international component. So it was usually a couple of American universities partnering with a university in Canada or a university in England with this computer component. So here's one example. A project that got funded was Michigan State, University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign, and I think the Southampton, University of Southampton in England. And they were, each of these institutions were looking at 3 different media, let's say, and by the nature of this program, there was a great deal of data involved. One was 56,000 quilts. And these were 56,000 quilts that had been digitized. So there's 56,000 plus digital, high-resolution digital images of these quilts. Another facet of this same project was about 100 14th century French manuscripts, illustrated manuscripts, beautiful, beautiful illustrated manuscripts. The third and last component of this project were 17th and 18th century maps of the Great Lakes. So here's a mashup. You know, here's 3 disparate institutions. One's looking at maps, one's looking at quilts, and the quilts were mostly 19th and 20th century, and the other was looking at 14th century French manuscripts. What they had in common was they were looking for patterns, continuation of similar patterns in the French manuscripts of illustrations, in the maps of the contours of the maps over 150 years, and the design of the quilt. So it was a pattern recognition exercise over a vast amount of digitized data. And that's where the Supercomputer Center came in at Illinois, and the High Performance Computer Center at Michigan State, and the High Performance Computer Center at Southampton. So different scholars of different expertise were then working on these maps, and the maps were divided by British maps over 150 years and French-made maps of the Great Lakes over 150 years. They were looking at, in the maps, was there a way you could trace authorship? Did a map that was drawn in, say, 1750 look like a map that was drawn 100 years later? Well, those 2 map makers were not living at the same time. How, then, were these similarities conveyed? So, and the same with the manuscripts. Were there particular kinds of drawings of knights and helmets? Were different kinds of colors used over a period of 150 years that suggests a linearity or a lineage of authorship that really transcends the authors themselves, but there was a progression through time of cultural forms of expression. Same thing with the quilts. A lot of the quilt research was trying to determine, part of it was trying to determine what's a crazy quilt and what's not a crazy quilt. And we think that's easy, and it's give it to a computer. It's a challenge. But it was the same thing. How are these patterns recognized? How are they permutated over time? And can you discern a lineage of authorship? So fundamentally, this project was about a very humanities traditional humanities question. What is authorship? How is cultural expression transmitted over time in various forms of continuity? Good question. And they have, their research is now beginning to be published about what they found. So what's interesting about this one, it's a kind of artificial mashup that NEH and these other agencies thought was worthwhile. The people participating in it learned more than they had ever imagined. Some of the greatest proponents of humanities research to come out of this are the computer scientists. And computer scientists are saying, you folks really have interesting problems, and we can help. And as far as preservation goes, this is the environment in which this research project and others like it was executed. There's a huge amount of data. So 56,000 quilts and all kinds of permutations of those quilts, hundreds and hundreds of maps, dozens of manuscripts, but those manuscripts are always parceled out and pixelated and analyzed in very sort of small discrete units and then reassembled. So, terabytes of data were created from this. Many algorithms were created, and these algorithms hold true for the maps. They're the same algorithms used for the quilts and the same ones that were used for the manuscripts. So here is a data set of algorithms, a huge amount of data, and also a lot of this information was susceptible to visualization, charts and graphs and diagrams and grids placed over these digitization of the quilts and all. That's a huge amount of data. And who's going to preserve it? Where is this data going to go? Where are these algorithms going to reside? We asked when we interviewed these project people, these algorithms hold true for the maps and the quilts. Any other disciplines? Oh, well, these algorithms, because of really cutting edge pattern recognition, will work for genomics. They'll work for proteomics. They'll work for genetics in general and forensics. And they listed about 15 other disciplines that could use this. So here's a project that is, at its core, it's kind of strange and interesting, but it has implications for a dozen other fields of study. So what's coming out of this is this new kind of research that is executed in an environment for which there are no preservation plans. That data could be lost, those algorithms could be lost, those visualizations could be lost. And one of the problems is not just the loss, but all of this is integral to the testing of the assumptions of this research. If you want to see if they get it right, you want to run these algorithms against your own data set. That requires an environment that's rich and layered and well preserved and maintained, and we don't have it. And the other piece of this, I'll stop with this, is that all of these projects, and this one in particular, came out with new kinds of, what I would call, scholarly expression. If you're going to talk about analyzing maps, then you have what? An article? Not really. Do you have a book? Well, not really. It's an odd length to begin with. It's full of images. It has algorithm and data in the background, which is considerable. And you can make it move if you want to see how the visualizations work. They often, come together, pull together, apart. That's the way this research was conducted. So to capture that research is very complicated. And you can't do it in a journal. You can't do it in a printed book. Where's it going to be published? Well, not so sure where this is going to be published. Conversely, this research could be reduced, boiled down, flattened, and turned into a typical two-dimensional object, but you lose a lot in that. So there's a number of issues here. One is the new forms of expression, one of the new kinds of methodologies that entail huge amounts of data analysis, background information, visualizations that have to, ideally, be continued and preserved over time. We don't have that, but we need to pay attention to that. The last two, I'll move along a bit more quickly. The third is a project that will be announced in about a month. And it's got kind of an inelegant name, but you can remember it. It's the Federated Research and Educational Depository System, FREDS. That's about the best they come up with. So FREDS is a consortial project, University of Virginia, Michigan University, Emory, Stanford University, and a few other universities and programs are working with this. And in essence, what it is, it's trying to be, it aspires to be a true system of preservation, preserving the academic record, broadly defined. That could be data, that could be algorithms, that could be digital articles, that could be course materials, could be student papers. You know, a lot of what's in institutional repositories and a lot of what's kind of floating around these days could be consolidated into FREDS. FREDS is to be designed as, to begin with, 3 or 4 separate dark archives, preservation purposes, dark archives. Each would be run on a different platform. So there would be redundancy of content across these archives, across these nodes, but not redundancy of platform and operating system. So if one crashed, say a virus attacked the HathiTrust, and the HathiTrust went down, turned into dust, the HathiTrust material would be preserved and made accessible through these 2 others. What FREDS wants to do is to start with 3, and build up to 5, 6, or 7, so you have a true national system at some point. I mention this because it has promise. It's an idea that's been around a long time. Over lunch today, we were talking about a report that came out in 1996 that really called for something like this, and not much has been done. It's very hard to get out of our institutional skins, to get out of the idiosyncratic world in which we are rewarded, to think on a much larger national level. If anything came out of this conference today, we've got to do it. National agencies have to do it, and so does higher education, working, one hopes, in concert with the national agencies. So this is interesting, 1, because of the scale, 2, because a number of several, almost probably at some point 10 to 12 universities that haven't really worked together before on something like this decided they needed to work together. It has, I think, significant implications for the preservation of information in higher education. And perhaps most importantly, the impetus for this was the realization by all of those involved that there is no program for preservation of higher education information, that all the digital curricular records, for the most part, faculty email, articles, digital articles, correspondence across institutions, there is no plan for this. And those involved would say, and I think that's a message for us, that if any, we have to make it clear that as we have moved, so quickly into this incredible dependency on digital information in a digital environment, and we have made no plans to preserve it as a national issue, we are subject to a catastrophic loss, absolutely catastrophic. And that's not hype. So again, this is a project to watch, I think. Its instincts are right. It's got some very good technical chops behind it. And again, it could be something that we all work together as in a kind of with the national agencies to promote or to contribute to, and vice versa. The last, number 4, is I mentioned this. It's the Digital Public Library of America, and many of you are you all familiar with this? The DPLA, pretty much. It's been on a lot of lists and it's popped up. It's a timely concept. It will have its national rollout here tomorrow, the National Archives. And it's subject to varying degrees of interpretation. What it looks like it will become, or could become, is a vast federation of American cultural heritage objects, and vast, and tens and tens of millions of digital books, tens of millions of digital images, tens of thousands of moving images, you name it. And these images, these objects would be drawn from libraries, historical societies and museums. Well, this could be, if it's done well, in 10 years, it could be one of the greatest resources we've ever seen. A multimedia treasure trove with the work being done not for the Digital Public Library of America to own these objects, but to be able to federate them so the original owners will remain owners. And we want to encourage, certainly want to encourage people to digitize and contribute to this, given that the platform works and the APIs work and the metadata and everything else is trustworthy, that people can contribute to this. So here we are sitting right at the cusp of what could be one of the most important undertakings we collectively have ever done. Preservation is not mentioned anywhere. And it's understandable to a point. But here we are, collectively, with dozens and dozens of institutions and agencies. The funding is strong, the interest is high. But what's missing is the preservation piece. So I think that will change. But it gives you an idea that this project is exhilarating in certain ways and also indicative of how we've kind of grown over the years. So again, all of us, we need to keep this project in mind. It has enormous implications for teaching and learning and research. If it's done well, you could make, if somebody wants to study in 1865, and instead of going to 15 different silos of digital resources, that person would have at her fingertips the newspapers and diaries and economic data and the photographs and books of that era and that pertain to that era. That's extraordinary. So it could be interest to a seasoned scholar or a 10-year-old who's really getting interested in the Civil War. That would be great. But if it's going to last, there has to be a program of sustainability and preservation. So again, if we build this, we have to take on the responsibility to sustain it. So I'll stop there. And I think that what's going on now really is just breathtaking. The transformations that are taking place in the humanities, the transformations that are taking place in this building out a new digital environment are extraordinary. But it needs a lot more thought, and it needs a lot more of us involved in its creation. To conclude, it seems to me, from my point of view, coming from the humanities, that preservation, the thought of preservation, the act of preservation, if you're trying to preserve our cultural legacy, it is one way of holding a mirror up. It holds a mirror up to our most valued accomplishments, and it is a means or a mechanism to promote and transmit those accomplishments through time. And it's also a way to hold a mirror up to ourselves and to what we value as most integral to our own humanity. I'll stop there. Thank you.
That brings us to the end of our program today. I want to thank you all for joining us, and thank you all for being here today, including our 50 visitors who are attending remotely from Pretoria, from the Yukon, and from all over the United States. Please take cookies and coffee as you depart. And if any of you have questions for our final speaker, please stop by as you leave. Thank you.
This has been a presentation of the Library of Congress. Visit us at loc.gov.